A woman screamed inside a birthing chamber made of mud and stone. But it wasn't the pain of labor that silenced the room. It was something deeper, something wrong. The scream ruptured the air like a detonation. Not just sound, something in the force split open. Candles shattered, metal bent, and within seconds, 3 midwives collapsed to the floor with blood streaming from their ears. The mother never finished her breath. Her body convulsed once, then fell still. The child was alive, but not crying. His eyes were open too wide, too silent, as if listening to something that wasn't there. The attendants did not wrap him. They did not speak. The village healer, an old Mirialan whose fingers shook from memory alone, stepped forward and touched the child's chest. Her eyes rolled back. She dropped dead. There was no mark on the child, no cut, no bruise, but the air around him felt cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with winter, the kind that sinks into the soul and tells it to run. They said it was the Force, but no Jedi would ever come to see. The Outer Rim planet was barely mapped, no Republic presence, no name known to Coruscant or Corellia, just a forgotten settlement of farmers and exiles who worshipped their own ghosts and buried their dead in silence. Now they had a birth they could not name, a child who should not have lived, a mother who had not died naturally, and a ripple in the Force that would never fade. In ancient Sith texts, there are stories of Force ruptures, moments where darkness concentrates so tightly inside a womb that the act of birth becomes a kind of weapon. Rare, dangerous, feared. This was one of those moments. Except no Sith had caused it, no Jedi had touched it, and no temple had predicted it. Whatever had happened here was raw, natural, born of the Force itself, not trained, not summoned. Just born. The villagers didn't speak of it for 3 days, not even to each other. They left the child in the birthing hut with the corpse of his mother, with a few drops of water in a cracked bowl, and a blanket made of stone-woven cloth. They thought the cold would take him, or the wind, or time, but he did not die. On the 4th night, a child from the village crept to the hut and peeked through the stone cracks. He saw something that turned his hair white. He never spoke again. Some said the boy had seen spirits floating above the newborn's head whispering. Others said the body of the mother had not decayed, that her eyes were still open, watching the child she could no longer hold. Whatever truth lived in that hut, the villagers decided together. The child would not be named, he would not be adopted, and he would never leave the outer ring of the canyon where the wastes began. They did not kill him, they didn't need to. The desert would take him, they thought. The silence would starve him, the dark would fold him in. But that was their mistake, because the Force does not forget its children, and this one had been born screaming not out of pain, but power. They would call him cursed, haunted, touched, but history would call him something else. This was the birth of Darth Insanius, the Sith who broke before he could ever begin. He was never named. No cradle, no ceremony, no lullabies. The villagers never returned to the birthing hut. Instead, they watched from the cliffs above, waiting for time to erase their guilt. They spoke of the child only in whispers. When winds howled through the canyon at night, they said it was him speaking without language. But the child did not cry. He didn't learn to. Instead, he watched. His eyes remained wide, too still for someone so young, and somehow he lived. No one fed him, yet he did not starve. No one cleaned him, yet disease did not claim him. Weeks turned to months. The bones of his mother dried beside him, untouched by decay. as if the Force itself refused to let go. There are records of Force-sensitive infants surviving without care but only under the protection of Jedi sanctuaries or Sith nurseries, where the energy around them fed their cells, strengthened their bodies. This was something else. The Force clung to him unnaturally, like it was feeding on him, not feeding him. And still, he grew. Eventually, the villagers pushed their fears aside just enough to act. A group of hunters was sent down not to kill him, but to remove the body of the mother and scatter ashes. A quiet ritual, a way to reclaim peace. They never made it to the hut. 2 of them turned back before reaching the outer canyon. The third, the youngest, dropped to his knees and clawed at his face. When they pulled him out, his mind was gone. They said he kept whispering one phrase, "He sees me." The child was only 3 years old. After that, the village elders ruled a new boundary. No one was to speak the boy's name. No one was to go within 20 paces of the hut. No gifts, no food, no curiosity. They declared him dead. But death never came. Instead, the child crawled. Slowly, he dragged himself to the edge of the cliff where dry roots twisted between stone. He found water dripping from the rocks. He caught insects in silence. He ate. He slept beneath the bones of his mother. He learned the rhythm of the wind, the shape of shadows, the shift of sand when footsteps approached from miles away. There are no written words from this time, no witnesses, but 4 sensitives who later touched the memory of this place, described it as heavy. One said it was like walking through someone else's scream. Another simply wept. By 5, the boy began to make sounds, but not words. Clicking, mimicking the calls of bone wasps, the rustle of beetle wings, the groan of the canyon before a quake. He was not learning language, he was copying the sounds of survival. At night, he dug shallow holes and placed stones inside. Sometimes, the stones moved on their own. He watched them without blinking. If animals came too close, they fled within seconds. If birds circled overhead, they never landed. The child had no name, but the Force knew him. And in the folds of the galaxy, there are moments when the Force listens, when it bends not to destiny, but to pain. The boy's presence was becoming louder, sharper, a wound forming its own echo. Not yet dangerous, not yet full, but growing. In time, someone would come, not from the village, not from the stars, but from a place darker than either. And they would not come with mercy. They would come because they recognized the boy for what he was. Not a miracle, not a curse, but a fracture in the Force, shaped like a child. There was no cradle left, no walls, no bones, only stone and silence. By the time he was 7, the child had stopped mimicking sounds. He had learned to listen not with ears, but with something deeper. The way the Force shifted when insects passed. The faint ripple of heat from a predator's breath. The quiet vibration of thought, pulsing behind stone. He did not speak, but he understood. Not language, not emotion, something older. He knew when the canyon would quake. He knew when the wind would die. And he knew when the villagers watched from far above, even if they never moved. They thought he was withering. They thought he was wasting away. But he was learning. At night, the Force wrapped around him like a mist. Sometimes cold, sometimes warm, always hungry. It did not guide him. It did not protect him. It studied him. And the boy studied back. There are moments in the Force rare and hidden when connection becomes communion. Not between Jedi and the light, not between Sith and the dark, but between the Force and a soul so broken that it becomes a mirror. That was what he had become, a mirror made of pain. One morning, a scavenger droid from an off-world trader passed overhead. It caught a glimpse of the boy through thermal scans, but what it saw made no sense. His body temperature was fluctuating, rising, dropping, as if it could not stabilize, as if his cells were changing. The droid turned back before reaching the outer ridge. Its memory core would later be found scorched, not destroyed by heat, but by signal corruption. The boy had not moved. It was around this time that something new began to form, small, ritualistic patterns in the dust, circles, spirals, marks that bore resemblance to Sith blood glyphs, but distorted, simplified, primal. The boy drew them with a finger, then waited. Sometimes, small creatures wandered into the circle and stopped moving. Their eyes rolled back, their bodies twitched, and then stillness. The boy would not eat them. He would bury them, then start again. Even without instruction, even without history, the Force had given him instinct. And that instinct was ritual. There is no record of him killing anyone. Not yet. But fear has its own gravity, and the villagers could feel it rising. The plants near the canyon began to wither. Water turned stale. Children complained of hearing humming at night, not outside, but from within their own minds. Still, no one dared to climb down. By age 8, the boy had grown taller, thinner, his spine curved from crawling. His skin was pale and cracked. But his eyes, they never blinked. Not once, not when watched. And sometimes, late at night, those who lived closest to the canyon would see a shape crouched against the cliff face, staring up at them. Waiting. He wasn't just surviving. He was changing. And the Force was watching. Legends speak of Vergence's wounds in the Force where energy gathers unnaturally. Most are created by war, death, mass trauma. But this was a Vergence born from silence, from neglect, from isolation so deep that it carved its own gravity. The boy had no training, no master, no path. But already he was becoming something the Jedi could not sense, something the Sith could not predict. He had no lightsaber. No voice, no purpose, only hunger, the kind that doesn't live in the stomach, the kind that grows in the soul, waiting to be fed. They did not come from the sky, they did not come from the village, they rose from the canyon itself, from tunnels carved long before the settlement ever existed. 3 figures cloaked in dust and silence. Their masks were bone-white, shaped like hollow faces frozen in a scream. They moved without sound, without breath, without hesitation. The child felt them long before he saw them. He had sensed their presence for weeks, faint ripples beneath the stone, like hearts beating inside the earth. He did not know what they were, only that they were coming, and that they were not afraid of him. When they emerged from the darkness, the canyon wind died. Birds fled. Even the insects grew still. The boy did not run. He stood on brittle ground, thin arms hanging at his sides, head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant echo. The symbols he had drawn in the dust glowed faintly under the morning light. The bone-masked figures examined them with quiet recognition. They spoke in a tongue older than basic, a language made of breath and vibration, not words. When translated centuries later, scholars would describe it as a ritual dialect used by fringe Sith cults who survived the fall of ancient empires. But at that moment, the boy only heard rhythm, a pulse, a call. The tallest figure knelt, slowly, carefully, as if kneeling before something sacred or dangerous. The boy stepped back, but the ground beneath him shifted. not from quake, from command. The force pressed lightly against his heels, urging him forward. Still, he did not move. He watched. One of the masked figures extended a hand, not offering warmth or comfort, offering recognition. A gesture not of family, but of claim. They had not come to save him. They had come because they felt the wound he carried, a raw, untrained power radiating through the dirt like heat from a dying star. They felt the virgins forming around him, dense and unshaped. Most children touched by the force shimmer faintly. He burned. The cult had no name, no written record, only a purpose whispered down through generations to find virginces of unnatural origin and harvest them. For knowledge, for prophecy, for fear. They circled the boy, tracing the marks he had drawn. One figure tapped the stone gently, testing the echo. Another placed a hand near his shoulder, not touching, only sensing. The last one whispered a phrase that caused the dust to rise around his feet. The boy's eyes followed every movement. His breathing slowed. Something familiar stirred in his chest, not comfort, not hope, recognition. As if he had always known someone would come from the dark. When the tallest figure finally touched his forehead, the ground trembled, not violently, softly. Like the canyon exhaling, the ritual was simple, a claiming right, a way to bind his presence to their own. But something unexpected happened. The moment the figure touched him, their mask cracked. A thin fracture ran across the bone surface, then another, and another. The cultists froze. The boy did not. He simply blinked once and the mask shattered completely, collapsing into dust. The figure staggered, breath drawn tight, as if an unseen force had reached into their ribs. The boy tilted his head. For the first time, the masked figures stepped back. They had come to claim him. But now, they understood. He was not a vessel. He was not a student. He was not a prophecy. He was a beginning. Silently, they bowed not in devotion, but in caution. Then they opened the path into the tunnels beneath the canyon. The boy followed without hesitation. He did not look back at the place where he had been born. There was nothing left for him there, only the dark, and those who knew how to use it. The mountain opened with no sound. It wasn't a door, not a gate, just stone shifting against itself as if it had always been waiting for him. The masked figures said nothing. They didn't have to. The boy followed without question, barefoot against cold rock, eyes wide but unblinking. The wind disappeared behind him. Light faded. Only the dark remained. The tunnels beneath Dakara were older than memory. Not built, grown over centuries of shifting stone and Sith ritual. No torches lined the path. Instead, faint veins of red crystal pulsed in the walls like arteries. Not bright enough to guide, just enough to remind the mind that it could still see. They led him down. He never looked back. There are no records of how deep the boy was taken. Some say the tunnels spiraled downward for days. Others believe he was never taken downward at all, only sideways, through layers of reality thinned by the force. What is certain is that when he emerged into the cult sanctuary, he was no longer in the world he had known. The chamber was not a room. It was a wound in the earth, open, breathing, ancient. Carvings lined every wall. Not words, not images, just patterns, cuts, symbols only the broken could understand. He saw them, and he understood. The cult did not greet him. They did not kneel or speak or offer warmth. They surrounded him in silence. Each figure robed in the same dust-stained fabric. Each face covered in the same expressionless mask. They moved like echoes, circling him with no sound, no rhythm, no order. Then one of them raised a hand. The stone beneath the boy glowed. A ritual had begun, but there were no incantations, no instructions, no weapons, only presence. They stared at him, pressed the force against him, waited. It wasn't a test, it was a reckoning. For any other child, it would have shattered the mind. The force was not gentle here. It was twisted, not light, not dark, but raw, unfiltered, like holding fire with bare hands. The energy in the chamber twisted through skin and memory, flooding into the boy's senses until time bent sideways. But he did not scream. He did not cry. He blinked once, then sat down, cross-legged, calm, like he'd done it before. The cult watched. One of them lowered their mask, just slightly, and for a moment, something like fear flickered across their face. They had brought children before, taken orphans from outer rim moons, found castaways drifting through forgotten force nexuses. Not all survived the ritual. Most bled. Some wept. None had sat down. In the weeks that followed, the boy was not spoken to, not fed, not named. He was simply left in the chamber surrounded by stone, symbols, and silence. Occasionally, a figure would appear and place an object before him. A cracked mask, a bleeding stone, a scroll written in reversed Sith glyphs. He never touched them, but he remembered them. And when the cult returned days later, they found the symbols carved again perfectly into the floor where he had sat. Not with tools, with his fingers, his nails bloodied down to the bone. He had not just memorized them, he had understood them. The cult called him Omen, but quietly, never out loud, not even among themselves. They began to speak of signs, that the bloodline of the old masters had returned, that something deeper had awakened beneath Dakara, something that was not Sith, but would become far worse. They did not teach him, they exposed him, and in that exposure, he was not shaped. He was revealed. The first sound he heard in the chamber was not speech, it was breath, slow, strained, drawn through a throat that no longer remembered how to form words. The cult gathered around him in a wide circle, each masked figure standing still enough to be mistaken for carved statues. Then the chanting began. It did not sound like language. It sounded like breaking. Voices layered over one another, high tones, twisting with low, words colliding until meaning dissolved into vibration. The boy did not look confused. He tilted his head, listening to every fractured syllable with the attention of someone observing the natural world. They were not teaching him. They were testing him. The chant grew louder. The air thickened. The walls trembled as ancient Sith phrases, long removed from any living dialect, rippled through the chamber. These were remnants from before the exiles, before Korriban's temples, before the code of the Sith had ever been written. The cult did not understand these chants fully. They only repeated what their ancestors had feared to whisper. But the boy understood the rhythm. When the tones shifted, he shifted his breathing. When the cadence broke, he straightened his spine. When the final note cracked into silence, he blinked once, as if acknowledging completion. A ripple passed through the cult. They did not show shock. They did not dare. But every masked figure leaned in slightly, the smallest movement betraying the truth. The child was learning faster than they ever had. One of them stepped forward. His robes were darker, marked with etchings that traced down his sleeves. He held a scroll sealed with black resin. When he cracked it open, the chamber grew colder. The glyphs inside were unstable, lines that refused to stay still, shapes that shifted like insects beneath skin. The ancient Sith called them fracture scripts, written forms used to tear thought apart and rebuild it through pain. No one outside the cult had seen them in centuries. Even the strongest acolytes bled from the nose after reading a single line. The boy stared, the glyphs moved, and for the first time, the cult saw him react. His pupils widened, his breath slowed, not in fear but in recognition, as if he had heard these symbols before, in the wind of the canyon or the silence after the rupture of his birth. He reached out, but not to touch the scroll. His fingers hovered above it, tracing the movement of the symbols as they writhed. His hand followed the script's shifting shape with uncanny precision, as though he were completing the sentence the scroll had not yet finished writing. The robed master snapped the scroll shut instantly, not out of anger, out of fear. Another chant began. This time, it was not sound but action. The cult struck the stone with their staffs in uneven patterns, creating echoes that bounced unpredictably around the chamber. These rhythms were designed to disorient, to fracture concentration, to overwhelm weaker minds. The boy did not flinch. He followed every echo, every strike, every vibration bouncing through the walls. He began to hum, quietly matching the frequency of the deepest echo. The sound was barely audible, but the moment it left his throat, the chamber changed. The echoes aligned, the vibrations converged. For a single second, the entire ritual synchronized around him, not because he understood their chant, but because the force bent toward his voice, tuning itself to his resonance. The cult froze. Their masks hid their faces, but not their fear. In all their history, they had never witnessed a child turn ritual into instinct. And still, he did not speak. He only listened. And remembered everything. Pain came without warning. Not punishment, not cruelty. Training. The cult believed that the force was a wound, and only through breaking the flesh could one break the veil between thought and power. They brought the boy into a smaller chamber, carved into the heart of the mountain. There were no symbols here, no chants, just stone, cold, unforgiving. A masked figure stepped forward and drew a blade carved from volcanic obsidian. Its edge shimmered faintly, humming with the memory of old rituals. This was not a weapon. It was a tool one used to carve lessons into bone and memory. The boy stood still. The blade touched his skin. He did not pull away. The cut was shallow but deliberate. A line down the arm, a mark meant to guide breathing, to control fear, to teach the body that pain was not an enemy, only information. He watched the blood gather on his skin, not with panic but with curiosity. Each drop shimmered faintly under the chamber's dim red glow. The cult watched him in silence. They expected trembling, tears, silence broken by fear. Instead, the boy raised his arm slightly, offering the blade a clearer path. The ritual continued. Cut, breath, silence. Cut, breath, silence. Each line was shaped according to ancient Sith patterns, lines meant to channel pain into awareness. Most initiates fainted before the seventh mark. Some screamed until their throats tore. A few went mad, lost to the echo of their own agony. The boy reached the 10th cut without a sound. By the 15th, he had begun to breathe in sync with the cultist holding the blade, matching rhythm, matching intent. Pain didn't weaken him. It clarified him. When the blade stopped, the cultist stepped back. Then the next trial began. Heat. A stone bowl was placed near his feet, filled with powdered minerals that burned without smoke or flame. The moment they ignited, the chamber filled with blistering heat. Skin should have blistered. Eyes should have dried. Breath should have failed. But the boy stepped closer. The heat bent around him like wind around a cliff, never touching directly, never leaving entirely. He held out his hand above the burning dust. His fingers trembled, but not from fear. From concentration. He was learning where pain lived. Where it ended, where he ended. The cultists exchanged glances behind their masks. One whispered a single phrase, a warning, not a celebration. He adapts too quickly. The trial shifted again. Cold. A basin of liquid from the deepest cavern, black, thick, and colder than ice, was placed at the center of the room. They forced his hands inside. Any other child would have screamed. The substance numbed nerves instantly, then stung as if filled with shards of crystal. The boy did not pull away. He watched the reflection of his own face in the liquid, distorted, trembling, and breathed until the pain steadied. He was not resisting it. He was absorbing it, using it to understand himself. When they removed his hands, the skin was pale and trembling, yet his eyes remained calm. The final lesson came without ritual. One cultist stepped behind him and placed a hand on his back, pressing the force directly into his spine. It was sharp, invasive, meant to tear instinct from bone. It was the kind of force pressure that broke acolytes, killed the unworthy. The boy staggered once but did not fall. Instead, he leaned into the pressure, as if welcoming it. The cult stood frozen. Pain had not shaped him. It had revealed him. This child was no vessel. He was becoming something far more dangerous. A mind that understood pain not as a prison, but as a path. He did not ask for a name, and they never gave one. In the cult's forgotten dialect, to name something was to bind it, to reduce it. What had been brought into their mountain was not something they could contain with syllables. He was referred to only in gestures, a tilt of the mask, a shift in breath, a pause before entering the chamber where he waited, always awake. The youngest cultists called him the Hollow. The elders said nothing. He had lived among them for weeks, maybe months. Time twisted in the deep places of Dikara. Light never reached the inner chambers. Only the heartbeat of the mountain, slow, heavy, humming with rituals older than the Republic itself. Still, the boy remembered everything. The chants, the scripts, the pain. He wore the scars as language, read them like lines of thought etched into his flesh. He mimicked no one, yet reflected them all like water that remembers every hand that tries to hold it. One night, the high ritualist entered his chamber alone. This was not normal. The leader wore no mask. His face was pale, lined with fractures from years of exposure to dark rituals. His eyes were clouded, not blind, but scorched by visions. He sat before the boy in silence. The air between them pulsed. The ritualist spoke a phrase, ancient Sith, a name meant only for lost prophets. The boy tilted his head. Then, quietly, he repeated it. The sound did not match the tongue it came from. It wasn't speech. It was vibration, deeper, layered, like it echoed backward through time. The stone floor trembled. The walls cracked just slightly. The ritualist bowed his head, not in worship, in resignation. He stood and left without another word. From that night on, no one entered the boy's chamber alone. They fed him scrolls written in blood. They offered fragments of kyber crystal once used in Sith blades. They burned incense from the tombs of failed Dark Lords. He consumed none of it. Yet every day, his presence deepened. The cult began to dream. Not visions, not prophecy, nightmares. They saw themselves in chains, their bones hollowed, their names erased from the Force, and at the center of it all, him. Not grown, not changed, just watching, always watching. They held another gathering. Masked figures, silent ritual, no fire. Only questions passed between glances. Had they found a prophet, a weapon, or something worse? One elder spoke what the others dared not. This is not an omen. This is a mirror. They had brought the child into their heart, thinking they would shape him, mold him into the vessel of their forgotten teachings. But he was not clay. He was reflection. Their broken chants became his language. Their suffering became his silence. He had not rejected their darkness. He had learned to absorb it. And now, it was turning inward. One cultist attempted to test him again. A simple pressure ritual designed to measure resistance. The boy stood still as the force was pressed against him. But this time, the pressure turned, folded, reversed. The cultist collapsed without being touched. Blood streamed from his ears. He would not wake again. The boy simply turned away. After that, they stopped touching him. He walked the tunnels as he wished. The doors opened without hands. The stones whispered beneath his feet. Even the mountain, old and unforgiving, began to hum in rhythm with his presence. They had called him Omen. Now, they spoke of him in hushed fragments. Not a title, not a curse, just a presence, a name they dared not speak. Because if they gave him one, it might answer back. The first voice came in the middle of the night, not through the ears, through the bone. A soft vibration that moved along his skull like a fingertip tracing a memory he didn't know he had. The chamber around him was silent. The cult slept in distant tunnels. No chanting, no trials, no pain. Yet something spoke. It sounded like him, but older. Exhausted, a whisper dragged across stone. Do not turn. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The voice lingered for only a heartbeat, then faded into the darkness as if swallowed by the mountain itself. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no breath, no pulse. Then another voice came, higher, sharper. A child's voice, his age, his tone. You will not survive this place. He looked into the darkness but saw only the faint red glow of crystal veins. He tried to answer, but his throat made no sound. The voice was not waiting for a reply. It was only repeating something it already knew. More whispers followed, some too soft to understand. Some spoken in tongues he had never heard. Some crying, some laughing. Not a single one belonged to anyone alive in the mountain. At first, the boy sat still and listened, but as the days passed, the voices grew clearer. They filled the silence between rituals. They echoed off walls. They curled around his thoughts until he could no longer tell where they began and where he ended. When he slept, he dreamed of faces he did not recognize, faces pressed against his vision like reflections on a cracked mirror. Some were wounded, some were whole, some were him. The cult noticed he no longer blinked. His stare deepened, like he was looking past the world instead of into it. They believed a threshold had been crossed. They believed the force was awakening inside him. They were wrong. The voices did not guide him. They did not comfort or command. They scraped against his mind, like broken metal dragged across the floor. Some pleaded, some warned, some whispered things he couldn't yet understand. But none were lies. One evening, during a ritual of silence, the boy froze. His eyes widened, not in fear, in recognition. A voice had spoken again. Low, calm, familiar. You should not follow them. He turned his head slightly, searching the chamber. But the cultists remained still, their masks blank, their thoughts hidden. The voice was not from them. It was from deeper within. And then, another voice answered it. You already did. Two voices, both his, one older, one younger, echoing through time, overlapping like threads pulled too tight. The boy pressed his palm to the floor. The stone beneath him pulsed, not with energy, with awareness, as if the mountain was listening, too. The voices grew louder, sometimes speaking over each other, sometimes whispering secrets he couldn't understand, sometimes screaming. He never covered his ears. He knew it would do nothing. The sound wasn't traveling through air. It was traveling through him. The cult mistook his stillness for obedience. They didn't see the tremor in his fingers. They didn't see the flicker in his pupils. They didn't see how his breath began to mimic rhythms the living could not make. They couldn't feel what was happening inside him, the fracture widening, letting the past and future slip through like water rising through cracked stone. The voices were not proof of power. They were proof of something breaking. And every night, when the chanting stopped and the torches dimmed, he sat alone on the cold stone floor, listening to his own mind splitting into a chorus that would never fall silent again. The voices never stopped. They weren't hallucinations. They didn't flicker like dreams or come with the wild panic of madness. They were calm, clear, consistent, and they were growing louder. By the time he was 10, the boy no longer reacted to the world in linear time. He responded to things before they happened. He would turn his head before a cultist entered the chamber. He would recite chants that hadn't been spoken yet. He would bleed from the nose just seconds before a glyph shattered into light. The cult began to whisper about temporal sensitivity, a rare trait where the force unfolded forward and backward around a user. Most Sith who glimpsed these patterns broke under the weight of contradiction. They saw too much too fast. Their minds unraveled. But this boy did not break. He adjusted. He learned to hold time like it was breath, to let it fill him, then release it in controlled rhythm. It wasn't prophecy. It wasn't foresight. It was something colder, like watching himself from the outside. The boy had become his own witness. He would sit for hours in perfect stillness, eyes half-lidded, body unmoving, but his mind was watching itself, listening to layers of thought overlapping like waves in a storm. When the cultists approached, he did not look up, but he knew their movements. He could hear their thoughts before they formed into words. One night, a young acolyte attempted to test him. He stepped into the boy's chamber with a silent blade, meant to draw a shallow cut across his arm, a test of reaction, of fear. The boy moved before the blade was drawn. Not with aggression, not even speed, just timing. His fingers wrapped around the acolyte's wrist in a grip too precise to be human. Then he whispered a word, soft, foreign, unfamiliar. The acolyte collapsed. No wound, no scream, just silence, his mind empty. The cult recovered him hours later. His body lived, but his memory did not. He had forgotten language, identity, even the word self. The boy had said only one word, and he had spoken it before the blade was ever raised. The elders knew something was wrong. They claimed it was progress, evolution, that his sensitivity to the Force was widening beyond the boundaries of past and future. But privately, they feared the truth. He was no longer inside time. He was adjacent to it. Sometimes, he would speak as though narrating his own life from the outside, describing events before they occurred, reciting the thoughts of others before they'd even been spoken. Not guesses, not visions. Memories pulled from moments that hadn't happened yet. The mountain itself began to shift. Glyphs carved centuries ago changed shape overnight. Rituals once requiring weeks of preparation collapsed into seconds of violent energy. The force around him grew sharp, like it was cutting through layers of history to match his pace. And the boy watched all of it happen, not with wonder, not with fear, with recognition. He began to draw symbols no one had taught him. Circular spirals overlaid with diagonal cuts, markings found only in the tombs of ancient Sith who had vanished from the known record. His fingers knew the shapes. His eyes did not question them. He was not remembering, he was returning. The cult still believed they were guiding him, but he was already past them. And in the cracks between one breath and the next, he heard his own voice again. They don't know what you are. He looked down at his hand, at the symbols he'd etched without meaning to. The whisper returned, quieter this time, deeper. But you do. He spoke his first word when no one was listening. Not to answer a question, not to obey. He simply opened his mouth and repeated a phrase that no one in the cult recognized. It wasn't Sith. It wasn't basic. It was a fragment of something older, not in language, but in rhythm. The sound echoed against the stone like a forgotten memory being pulled back from the edge of time. The nearest cultist froze, head tilting slightly beneath the mask. They didn't ask the boy to repeat it. They simply left. The phrase was recorded, translated, and searched across a dozen dead dialects. It wasn't written anywhere, and yet the boy said it again the next day, then again, a week later. Each time the inflection changed. The word shaped itself depending on who was near, like it was alive, like it was responding to something deeper than hearing. Soon, he began to speak more. Not full sentences, just fragments, phrases that didn't seem to belong to him. At times, he sounded like a woman crying. At others, like a soldier screaming through static. Once, he whispered an entire conversation that would not happen for 3 days. The cult listened, quietly, carefully. They did not interrupt. To them, it was proof that the boy had become a vessel for the Force itself, channeling voices across time and death. They documented his words, chanted them, built rituals around them. But they were wrong. He wasn't channeling the Force. The Force was listening to him. He spoke in loops. Some of the voices were his own, but older, broken, wiser. Some were voices of others, people who had never entered the mountain, people who had never been born. He quoted Sith lords whose names had been erased. He whispered birth dates, death dates, the last words of men who hadn't yet drawn their last breath. One morning, a scribe found him drawing faces on the stone, hundreds of them, each one carved with unnatural precision, some human, some not, all of them unfamiliar. When asked what the drawings were, the boy answered with a quiet phrase, "These are the ones who speak." The cult began to worry. They called the council into the central chamber to observe him in silence. He stood calmly beneath the glowing red crystals, staring ahead, unmoving. Then, without warning, he began to laugh. But it wasn't his laugh. It was the laugh of someone old, someone sick, a voice that cracked halfway through with the weight of age. The sound filled the chamber with something colder than fear. He looked each elder in the eye, one by one, and spoke in their own voices, repeating things they had said in private, or in dreams, or long ago, when they were children. Then he fell silent, and they understood. He was not being possessed. He was not being guided. He was remembering lives that had not yet been lived. Whatever had broken open inside him was not madness, it was clarity. And the cult began to wonder if they had created it, or simply found it already in motion. A mirror, not of truth, not of prophecy, but of possibilities. Reflections of voices not yet born, paths not yet taken. names not yet written in the tombs of the Sith, and he was speaking them aloud, one by one, as if he already knew where this all would end. The cult began to fear the silence between his words more than the words themselves. Every time he spoke, something changed. A symbol etched into the walls would shift by morning. A ritual that once took hours would now collapse in seconds. One acolyte lost all memory of their training after hearing a phrase the boy muttered in passing. They tried to contain it, slow it down. They made him fast for days, then buried him in silence. No stimuli, no contact, just stone and stillness. But the voices continued, and when they returned to his chamber, he had carved a new pattern into the floor, one they had never taught, one that pulsed faintly when approached. When they stepped across it, their breath caught. For just a second, each cultist felt their thoughts stutter like a dream being rewritten halfway through. Not erased, not blocked, redirected. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't moved, but he had touched something, and it had touched them back. The cult elders gathered in secret. They debated sealing the boy in the lower crypts, where rituals were forbidden. They considered silencing him completely through force binding, or worse. But no one dared act, because each of them, in different moments, had heard him whisper their own voice. Not out loud, not spoken, heard. The child was watching them, even when they were alone, even when they were sleeping, even when they were trying not to think about him. It was no longer possible to tell where their thoughts ended and his began. One elder dared to confront him, a ritualist who had trained in the tombs of Zayast. He believed the boy's mind was unstable, that it could be controlled if forced to focus. He brought a kyber shard cracked from a Jedi's blade and placed it in the center of the chamber. The boy stared at it, and then the stone cracked. Not the shard, the chamber. Lines spread across the floor, bleeding light from beneath as if something underneath had stirred in response. The elder dropped to one knee, overwhelmed by the pressure in the force. His nose bled. His mind twisted. The boy did nothing. The crystal melted without flame. The elder would spend the rest of his life in silence, whispering the same word over and over: reflection. From that day forward, no one dared test him again. He was no longer a subject of training, no longer a vessel. He was something else. Even the mountain changed. Tunnels that had been sealed for centuries opened overnight. Others collapsed without warning. The patterns of light in the crystal veins shifted, following him as he walked. Animals that had once lived in the deep places vanished entirely. He didn't speak often, but when he did, reality bent. The cult began to unravel. Rituals failed. Glyphs lost their meaning. Some elders simply walked into the tunnels and never returned. Others wept during meditation, convinced they had seen their own deaths inside his eyes. They had once believed he would become their salvation. Now they knew he was something much older, a fracture that couldn't be healed, a presence that could not be directed. They had taken him in to mold him, but they had reached too deep, and now something was watching through his eyes. Not a god, not a ghost, something else, something that remembered too much. Something that should have stayed buried. The cult no longer chanted his name, because now they knew the truth. He had never needed one. He did not arrive with an army. He came alone. A single ship, scorched and silent, drifted down into the wastes beyond the mountain. The cult did not resist. They felt him before they saw him. A presence like smoke laced with glass, painful to touch, impossible to grasp. Darth Insanius, a name that had not been spoken aloud in decades. A Sith Lord stripped from the rule of two by Darth Zoradis generations prior. Not for weakness, but for what he practiced. He did not believe in dominion. He believed in transformation. Atreus had disappeared into the outer voids beyond Malachor after his exile, where the remnants of forgotten Sith species still whispered through dust. He returned only to collect what he needed, and this time he wanted the boy. The cult did not question him. They didn't ask for payment, didn't negotiate, didn't explain. They had already begun to fear what the boy was becoming. And Atreus had come not to control him, but to refine him. The boy did not speak as he was led toward the waiting vessel. He did not resist. He turned his head once not to say farewell, but to imprint the layout of the mountain behind him. Then he boarded. They left in silence. No alarms, no ceremony, just absence. The ship was old hand-welded in places, alchemically bound in others. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The air inside was thick, recycled through ancient filtration systems that still remembered fire. It did not feel like a place of travel. It felt like something alive. Atreus did not speak for hours. He sat across from the boy, watching, breathing, waiting. The force between them was dense. Not hostile, not cold, but heavy, weighted with expectation. The boy blinked once. Atreus nodded. Whatever communication passed between them in that moment did not come in words. It came through the unspoken language of the Sith of minds tuned to fracture. Power shaped through violation, will bent not through dominance, but through insight. This was not a master who wanted obedience. This was a master who wanted a mirror. They traveled deep into the outer rim, beyond charted hyperlanes, past Vision, past the wreck fields of Old Republic slaughter, past even the burned stars of the Nile's last reach, to a place called Vertepe. It had once been a forge world, a fortress built by the ancient followers of Carnus Muir. There were no cities left. No towers, just bones. The sky burned violet at night from the ion storms that never ended. The surface rippled with exposed bedrock and veins of crystal too unstable to harvest. Atreus brought him there for a reason. Not for safety, not for secrecy, for raw material. The lower levels of Vertepe were still intact vaults, filled with the remains of Sith-spawn experiments long buried, corpse pits from failed rituals, blood basins that no longer smelled like death, because death had become the air itself. Atreus spoke for the first time when they entered the lowest chamber. "This is where we begin." His voice was coarse, scraped raw from years of silence. It didn't command. It didn't question. It acknowledged. The boy stepped forward. The walls were etched with patterns from 1,000 different heresies, not Sith code, but deviations from it. Glyphs used only once, then banned. Syllables that bent the force through emotion so precise, they left a mark in the stone. He reached out. The stone responded, not with light, not with power, with recognition. Atreus watched carefully. He had not chosen this child because of prophecy, or legend, or fate. He had chosen him because he saw something no Sith was ever supposed to see. A mind that could not be shaped, only sharpened. It was not a temple in the traditional sense. There were no statues, no shrines, no altar to the Sith code. The structure beneath Vertepe was a vault, a sealed hollow of machinery, bone, and ritual scars, forgotten by time but never by the Force. Atreus called it the Crucible. It had once been used by exiles from the old Muir line Sith heretics who believed flesh was the only path to truth. They rejected the teachings of holocrons and lightsabers. They twisted life instead, bent it into shapes the Jedi refused to name. Atreides had kept their work alive, and now he wanted the boy to see it. He did not begin with lectures. He did not explain the symbols carved into the walls or the crimson vats bubbling with preserved tissue. He did not introduce the things that still breathed in the dark corners of the forge chambers. He simply opened the vaults and let the boy walk. The first room pulsed. Thick tubes ran through the walls like veins. At their ends, clusters of muscle no longer human twitched in rhythmic spasms. Nerve fibers dangled from ceiling to floor, linked by threads of force-sensitive sinew that responded to thought like antennae. The boy did not recoil. He stepped forward, watching the movements. His breath slowed. One of the muscle clusters pulsed in time with his heart. Atreides said nothing. He led the boy to the next room. Here, slabs of flesh floated in liquid tanks. Some were eyes, some were lungs, some were entire faces, grown from nothing but energy and trauma. They stared blankly through the green fluid. Not alive, not dead. Memory made solid. "Do you know what these are?" Atreides asked. The boy blinked once. The Sith Lord nodded. "They're not failures, they're attempts. The Force is a tool, not a religion, and life is its language." He pressed his hand to one of the tanks. Inside, the face twitched. "These are the syllables." For weeks, the boy observed in silence. Atreides never rushed him, never tested him. He simply allowed access, gave him time, let him listen not to voices, but to process. This was not alchemy the way the ancient Sith practiced it. This was something slower, sharper, less about power, more about detail. It was science wrapped in pain. The Temple of Broken Things was not designed to create monsters. It was designed to ask questions the Force was never meant to answer. How much suffering can memory hold? How many minds can inhabit a single body? What shape does grief take when grown in a tank? The boy began to trace patterns in the condensation that formed on the glass tanks. Not random, not childish. They were glyphs of alignment, the kind only seen in failed Rakatan Force labs or the murals of Nathema, where the Force had once been drained from the world entirely. But he had never seen those places. He simply knew the shapes. Atreides began to take notes. At night, the boy didn't sleep. He walked the forge halls and touched the ancient machinery. His breath fogged the surfaces. Sometimes, the fog stayed, clung to the metal like a fingerprint left in the Force. The experiments began. First, Atreides showed him how to bind tissue, then how to preserve memory in fluid, then how to lace Force impressions into marrow. The boy never flinched, never faltered. But he never copied his master. He watched, he remembered, he waited. And when Atreides asked him to replicate the process, the boy said nothing. He turned away and built something different. Something that did not bleed, but listened. It began without permission. Atreides had left the chamber, expecting the boy to continue studying the preserved forms, the failed limbs, the twitching organs, the bloodless frames that drifted in containment fields. But Insanius was no longer interested in watching. He had learned what he needed. Not from the rituals, not from the instructions, from the failures. He had noticed something Atreides never spoke aloud, that the experiments pulsed not in defiance of death, but in memory of it. They were not truly alive. They responded to commands, but they did not think. They did not feel. They were echoes shaped by grief. That was not enough. He wanted to make something different. He entered the lower chamber alone, the one Atreides never opened, the one where nothing pulsed, nothing twitched. Just silence, a room where the force felt stretched thin, like sound inside a sealed tomb. And there, on a slab of black stone, he began. No chanting, no incantation, no blade, just motion. He reached into the tank of discarded tissue, not the active samples, but the scraps and pulled fragments that had already begun to rot. He placed them on the slab with precision, arranging them by weight, by tension, by feeling. Then he sat in front of them and breathed, slowly, deeply, like he was sinking below water. He began to hum. The sound had no melody, no tradition. It wasn't a chant or a Sith code. It was the same hum he used as a child when insects gathered near him. The rhythm of his own pulse stretched into the air. The room responded. The force grew quiet, not absent, but still. He pressed his hands to the slab, and the fragments began to move. Not in twitching spasms like Atrenus's creations, not like nerves jolted by energy, but slow, aware movement, one tendon sliding across another like it knew where to go. Bone fragments shifting to meet ligaments, a spine curling into itself as if waking from a long sleep. He did not direct it. He only watched. The process continued for hours. He never moved. He never looked away. The pieces assembled themselves with a kind of quiet determination, not guided by power, but by something deeper, by intention. When Atrenus finally returned, he stopped in the doorway. The boy was still seated, still humming, and on the slab before him was a form incomplete, faceless but breathing. Its chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm. Its fingers curled around the edge of the stone. No sparks, no chants, no restraints, just a body, aware of its own shape. It was not beautiful, it was not monstrous, it was still, and it was looking at them. Atrenus said nothing. He stepped closer, and the form tilted its head toward him. Not instinct, recognition. It didn't lunge, it didn't obey. It only watched, like the boy had once watched. "What is it?" Atrenus whispered. The boy answered, finally. "It remembers." The Sith Lord took another step forward. Slowly, carefully. The force in the room was dense, but not hostile. It was present, alive in a way that no ritual could produce. He reached out not to touch, but to sense, and felt something that stopped him cold. Not hunger, not rage, not confusion, grief. The thing on the slab was grieving. It had just been born, but it missed something. Atrenus backed away. He had taught the boy to manipulate matter, to shape pain into motion. But this was feeling. The boy hadn't made a servant or a weapon. He had made a witness, something that should not live, but now did. Atrenus could not sleep after witnessing the creation, not because it frightened him, but because he understood it. In the long, bitter history of the Sith, there were many forms of power domination, deception, destruction, but only one was truly forbidden: creation. Not shaping life through crude rituals or forcing tissue to obey commands, but allowing the force to express something new. What the boy made had not been summoned. It had answered. Atrenus had seen Sith Lords tear open realities, rip souls from bodies, bind ghosts into weapons. None of them had ever made something that felt sorrow the moment it breathed. It meant the boy was operating beyond instruction, beyond control, beyond the boundaries Sith alchemy was meant to obey. And that meant one thing: he was becoming dangerous. Atrenus watched him for days, hiding his fear behind rigid discipline. The boy did not speak again. He sat beside the breathing form he had created, as if guarding it. The creature responded to him like a shadow, not obeying, not following, but reflecting. When the boy tilted his head, it did the same. When he paused his breath, it stilled its own. When he slept, its eyes remained open. Observing, Atrinus knew this could not continue. The rule of two had exiled him long ago, but not even heretics were blind to its truth. Power like this could unmake an empire or erase it without effort. There could never be two Sith with such potential. Only one, the master or the apprentice. Atrinus made his decision in silence. He lured the boy into the deepest vault, the chamber of inversion, where rituals were performed to unmake memory and sever identity. It was a place meant to break Sith who strayed too far from discipline. A place where the Force twisted in on itself like a wounded animal. The boy followed without resistance. The creature he had created watched them leave, but did not move. Atrinus sealed the door behind them. No light, no sound. Only darkness so thick it bent the edges of thought. "This is where you stop," he said quietly. Not in anger, not in hatred, in acceptance. He raised his hand to begin the ritual. The air changed. The boy was no longer standing. He was beside Atrinus. His presence shifted like a ripple. No footsteps, no motion. Just a change in location, as if he had decided to be somewhere else, and the Force obeyed. Atrinus froze. The boy touched his wrist. No pain followed. Instead, Atrinus felt something impossible, his own memories slipping, turning, rearranging, not erased, reversed. Like watching his life run backward through shattered glass. The ritual of reversal was ancient. A technique once whispered by sorcerers of Tund, meant only for objects, never for living flesh. He had never taught it, never even practiced it. But the boy understood it. He breathed a single phrase, soft, calm, spoken in Atrinus's own voice. The vault answered. Light cracked through the darkness, bending around them like a breaking mirror. Atrinus collapsed to his knees as the Force folded his mind inward, peeling back layers of identity, exposing the fear he had hidden behind pride. He tried to shout. The boy simply watched. His eyes carried no hatred, no triumph, only recognition, the same quiet, unreadable expression he had when creating the breathing form on the slab. The Force surged. Atrinus convulsed once, then stilled. When the light faded, he was not dead. His body remained. His breath continued. But the mind behind his eyes was empty, not destroyed, rewritten. Stripped of name, memory, ambition. A vessel without a past. The boy stepped back. The last lesson had been given, and the master had become the creation. There was no battle, no lightsabers, no shouting, no betrayal in the traditional sense. Atrinus didn't expect a fight. He expected obedience, or at most, rebellion. He was prepared for rage, for ambition, for the kind of hunger he had once wielded himself. But Insanius did not rebel. He unfolded. It began in the upper chamber, where Atrinus summoned him after weeks of silence. The creature still lay breathing on the slab below. It had not moved in days, but its eyes had never closed. It had watched everything. Atrinus stood by the ancient altar, surrounded by fragments of glyphwork and fading sigils from rituals long forgotten. He had prepared a binding incantation, layered beneath layers of defensive pressure, not to harm the boy but to seal his potential, contain it. Insanius entered with his head tilted slightly, as if already aware of what was about to happen. He stepped into the circle and waited. The Sith Lord didn't hesitate. He began the ritual. The chamber dimmed, symbols on the walls reignited, pulsing in time with his breath. Atrinus spoke words that had not been uttered in 1,000 years, words that bent the force around the boy's body like a tightening fist. Still, Insanius did not move. Atrinus continued, pushing harder. The force thickened, becoming a wall of pressure designed to silence memory, lock identity, suppress thought. It was a method developed for unstable Sith spawn, one he had used before. But then something cracked. Not in the air. In him. Atrinus faltered. A thought entered his mind that did not belong to him. It was quiet, familiar. His own voice. "You've done this before. And it didn't work then." He staggered, blinking rapidly. The circle of energy around the boy flickered. Insanius took one step forward. Then another. Atrinus tried to raise his hand, but it was no longer responding. His vision blurred. Words swam in front of his eyes. Not from the ritual, from memory. His own. But not how he remembered them. He saw his mother's face, but younger than it should have been. Heard the voice of a master he had never studied under. Felt the sting of exile, but from a courtroom that never existed. The boy had begun the ritual of reversal, not as attack, as invitation. Atrinus struggled to speak, but his mouth moved with someone else's voice. The boy was not fighting. He was mirroring. Every fear Atrinus had ever hidden, every flaw he had buried under power, every forgotten regret, now played through him like a second skin. Insanius stepped closer. No anger, no violence, just quiet, even breath. Atrinus felt his body locking up, not paralyzed, overwhelmed, like too many lives were trying to pass through him at once. A memory surfaced, one that wasn't his. A battlefield, not one he had fought on. Bodies, smoke. A boy standing alone in the center, covered in ash. Then another. A Sith temple collapsing in slow motion. A voice repeating the same phrase in a language no one alive should remember. Then another. Then another. The force bent in the room, not lashing out, not flaring, just spilling. Time loosened. Atrinus fell to one knee. The boy stood over him, still silent. The last thing Atrinus saw before losing himself was the look in the boy's eyes. Not hatred, not triumph. Recognition. As if this moment had already happened. As if it had always happened. Then the lights in the chamber flickered and died. The fortress began to break the moment Atrinus fell. Not from battle, not from fire, from reflection. The ritual of reversal had left its mark not only on the master, but on the stone itself. The chamber that once pulsed with control now pulsed with memory. Not memory from one life, from many. All layered, all active, all unresolved. Insanius stepped away from Atrinus's body. The Sith Lord still breathed, but without meaning. The force around him was dull like a blade submerged in water. He was no longer a presence, just a container. The boy looked up. The sigils lining the vault began to twist. Not crack, twist. Their angles pulled against themselves as if trying to escape their own design. Glyphs burned through the walls in spirals, unwriting the symbols Atrinus had spent years perfecting. The force within the crucible was no longer stable. It had become recursive. Every echo spawned a new echo. Every memory folded back onto itself. The vaults began to hum. Far below, in the sealed chambers, failed experiments began to stir. Limbs twitched in vats that had long since cooled. Flesh that should have rotted pulsed once. Then again. And then all at once. The fortress was waking up, but not in resurrection. In confusion. Atrinus's creations had never been alive in the true sense. They had been shaped by power, bound by pain. But now, the force inside them had been inverted. They began to remember things they were never meant to: faces, sounds, screams that had not yet been screamed. Insanius descended the stairs without urgency. The walls shook as he passed, not from tremors, from disagreement. The structure of the crucible no longer understood itself. One corridor collapsed behind him, folding inward like melted glass. Another bled smoke from cracks in the ceiling, where the stone had softened into pulp. He passed the chamber of grafted torsos. They had once lain still, half-formed, twitching at the edge of failure. Now they whispered. Not words, not language, just breath rising and falling in uneven rhythm, as if they were trying to speak for the first time, or remember how. The deeper he went, the louder the fortress became. The rituals carved into its walls etched by Atreus, by the heretics before him, by the forgotten exiles who came after Carnus Muir were unraveling. Not just erasing, but rewriting. Insanius walked through a hallway of mirrors that had never reflected light, only intention. Now, they showed scenes from other places, other times. A ruined Jedi temple, a Sith Lord screaming into a darkened sky, a figure in a mask laughing through blood. He touched nothing. He didn't need to. Everything was reacting to him, like heat rising off memory, like the very foundation of the crucible knew it had served its final purpose. And at the center of it all waiting was the breathing form, still on the slab, still watching. It hadn't moved since the ritual began. But now, as the walls began to bend, as the floor cracked beneath it, as the force warped with every breath, it blinked, just once. Then its head turned slowly, toward him. No terror, no warning, just mutual understanding. It had always been waiting for this. Behind them, the vaults screamed. Dozens of rooms collapsed in on themselves as rituals reversed, containers split open, and machines built to preserve agony now absorbed it. The fortress could no longer hold its shape. It was becoming what it had hidden for so long, a memory too unstable to survive. Insanius did not run. He stepped into the storm as calmly as he had walked into the mountain as a child. He was not breaking the crucible. He was ending it. The smoke did not rise. It folded inward, curling into the ruins like breath returning to a dying mouth. Vertepi was no longer a fortress. The stone had softened. The walls had buckled. Whole chambers had melted into themselves, their glyphs dissolved, their echoes smothered. No survivors, no structure. Only fragments, and yet something remained. Buried beneath the wreckage of the crucible, the center still pulsed. Not with power, with memory. The force around it did not lash out. It pressed inward as if trying to contain what had happened, to hold it still long enough to make sense of it. But the force could not understand what it had witnessed. There had been no duel. No death, just a ritual that had changed too many things at once. In the place where Atreus had once spoken his last words, the walls had turned black, not from flame, from focus. The obsidian surface, once smooth, now bore a mark that had not been carved by hands. A name, but not written in language, etched in blood, in heat, in silent pressure shaped into the stone by will alone. The force remembered what had been spoken, and so the stone remembered it too. It was not a Sith name, not one passed down, not one recorded. It had never been spoken before that day, but it was his. The breath of the crucible stilled. The creature on the slab, the thing that had once watched, waited, mimicked, now sat in silence. Its eyes did not blink, its mouth did not move, but its chest still rose and fell. It, too, had heard the name. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the cult that had once surrendered the boy felt the echo ripple through the force. Not in language, in sensation. They didn't speak of it. They didn't write it down. But every one of them knew. He had survived. And he had changed. Some whispered of Atrenus's fall. Others believed the fortress had been consumed by a deeper presence, that Tepe had never truly been a place, only a passage. What they could not deny was what came next. Over the weeks that followed, scavenger droids sent to explore the ruins vanished. Jedi archivists scanning for dark side remnants reported disruptions in hyperspace routes near the sector. Probes malfunctioned, surveyors lost signal, and every time one dared to get close, the only thing they received was an image. A single obsidian wall, cracked through the middle, with a mark etched into its surface. Not a word, a wound, one that bled presence through the force, like heat through metal. Those who studied it too long claimed to hear whispering. Not voices, not prophecy, just breathing. Some said it was the breath of the creature left behind. Others claimed it was the planet remembering. But the truth was simpler. The name carved into stone was not a monument. It was a warning. The being who had once been taken from the canyon, passed from cult to exile, shaped in silence and fed with memory, had not claimed the crucible as his throne. He had not rebuilt it. He had marked it. Because he would not stay. The name was not a declaration of power. It was a footprint left behind. A trace of something that would never return to that place again. It had seen enough, felt enough, learned enough. The name etched in obsidian did not ask to be remembered. It simply refused to be forgotten. He didn't take a ship. He walked, out through the cracked vaults, across the fractured stone where blood once boiled, past the shattered machines and still burning memory tanks. The air was thick with ruin, but he breathed it in, as if it belonged to him. He left Atrenus's body behind, left the breathing creature behind, left the name in the stone, unspoken. There was no triumph, no final glance, no last word. He simply walked, without a sound, without a reason anyone could name. No one followed. The fortress, once a place of process and pressure, was now hollow. Not empty, hollow. Like something had been removed from it that should never have been placed there to begin with. The force around the region dimmed, not in weakness, in grief. It felt like a place that had told its story, and now had nothing left to say. Days passed, then weeks. Scouts sent to find him reported nothing. The desert around Tepe offered no tracks, no heat signatures, no biological residue. One surveyor claimed the sand itself rejected footprints where he had passed, that the wind stilled for him, that the stars dimmed. The report was dismissed, but it wasn't wrong. He didn't return to the cult. He didn't contact any Sith. No signals were traced. No artifacts surfaced. No rumors whispered of a new acolyte rising in the shadows. He had not gone into hiding. He had disappeared. Not into darkness, into distance. There is a difference. Darkness suggests motive, a hunger, a plan, a craving for control. But distance is something else. It's what happens when a mind unhooks itself from the systems that shaped it. When it chooses not to dominate, but to drift. He became a myth almost immediately. The Sith never claimed him. The Jedi never sensed him. He was too quiet, too strange, too out of rhythm with the wars they understood. But every so often, Force sensitives, usually children, reported dreams of a boy made of mirrors, walking through empty places, never speaking, never aging. They would wake up crying, not from fear, From recognition, because something in him felt familiar, not like family, like memory, a memory they hadn't made yet. The creature he had left behind eventually stopped breathing. No sound, no decay, it simply went still. Its eyes remained open for weeks. Then, one day, they closed, and no one opened the vault again. The ruins were buried by time, wind, dust. The name remained, but the figure who had made it walked far beyond that place, beyond legends, beyond the systems where Sith and Jedi warred for power they barely understood. He did not seek a cause. He did not seek revenge. He simply walked. Some said he wandered the deep core, where gravity twists in impossible ways and stars collapse without noise. Others claimed he had entered a forgotten world in the unknown regions, where rituals spoke to the void instead of the Force. The truth remains unclear. But one thing was certain. He did not want to be found. Because he was no longer a student, no longer an apprentice, no longer a creation. He was becoming, not into a Sith, not into a god, but into a silence that watches and waits, a silence that once had no name, but now carried one wherever it walked. It was not found on any chart. No hyperspace beacon pointed to it. No ancient star map recorded its presence. It drifted deep in the core, behind collapsed stars and phantom gravity wells where navigation failed and signals looped endlessly until memory dissolved. The Sith had once called it Nox Votarix, the vault that waits, a relic from the age before the rule of two. A vault ship launched by a faction of exiled alchemists who believed knowledge should only be recorded in suffering. It was thought to have perished during the Third Great Schism, torn apart during the collapse of the Great Shadow Conclave. But it hadn't perished. It had hidden, and it waited for someone who would understand it. Insanius did not find it by chance. He didn't search. He didn't trace Sith pathways or follow rituals. He simply drifted, carried by the Force through starless dark until the shape revealed itself broken and massive, lodged in the burnt gravity of a collapsed star's edge. The ship was no longer alive, but it wasn't dead either. Its hull was fractured open like bone under pressure, revealing hollow decks and black corridors that stretched far deeper than the ship's dimensions should have allowed. The airlock was sealed in rust. It opened without touch. The boy stepped inside. The metal groaned under his feet, not with decay, but with recognition. Lights flickered faintly, not from power cells, those were long gone, but from memory. The ship's walls retained a kind of residual awareness, carved into every surface, every passage. The force inside the vault did not flow. It coiled. It didn't test him. It welcomed him. The entry hall bore carvings from dozens of Sith dialects, many known, most forgotten. But they all repeated the same sentiment. Truth requires agony. Insanius passed through them without pause. He moved deeper into the vessel, through the broken atriums and collapsed sanctums, rooms where failed experiments still rotted in cages made of obsidian, chambers where entire walls had been scorched black from uncontrolled rituals. In every corridor, the air was thick with voices, not speech, echoes. They did not speak in phrases, they screamed, they whispered, they wept, some in languages lost to history, others in silence. They weren't spirits. They weren't alive. They were recordings etched into the Force by pain so deep it couldn't be erased. Insanius stopped in one chamber and listened for hours. He traced the sound of a scream embedded into a support beam. He followed its resonance into a ceiling vent, where the final breath of a dying Sith had become a memory loop, barely audible unless one stood perfectly still. He stayed there for 3 days. And then he began to move again. There were no beds, no supplies, nothing human left. But he did not hunger. He did not sleep in the way others did. He had found what he was looking for, though he never knew he was searching. A place where suffering was not an accident, it was kept. The vault ship had become an archive of pain, not as a punishment, as a method. Every wall was a scroll, every corridor a tomb, every echo a lesson carved into reality through the Force. Insanius sat in the main chamber, beneath the broken spire of the central hall. Around him, the ship whispered. He did not flinch. He did not resist. He listened, because pain, here, was not his enemy. It was the only thing that still remembered what truth sounded like. The vault was not silent. It whispered constantly. Not in language, in pain. Every room held echoes, not of events, of moments, the kind that linger in the Force long after the body fails, the kind too sharp to fade. They vibrated through the ship's frame like veins under skin, pulsing with every breath he took. Insanius didn't pass through them quickly. He stayed. He wandered through the halls like a scholar, not a conqueror. He listened. He traced the air with his hands until the vibrations responded to him, until the scream behind a wall grew clearer, until a whisper hidden in the corner of a long-sealed meditation cell reached his ear and asked softly, "Did it work?" Some rooms held voices that looped. One chamber played a memory so often it had burned a hole in the Force. A Sith apprentice begging for her master's forgiveness in a language that no longer had vowels. She never finished the plea. She never got an answer. The loop reset before the final syllable. Again and again, Insanius sat in the middle of that room for a day and a half. He never blinked. Other rooms held fragments, disconnected emotions, stored like data. A father's shame, a student's terror, a warlord's guilt locked behind laughter that never fully died. These weren't recordings. They weren't even hauntings. They were residue, pain without a body. And he understood them. He didn't just hear them. He read them, like glyphs carved into air. He mapped the way each scream echoed, followed its vibration across the room until it intersected with another. With time, he realized the ship wasn't just housing memory. It was organizing it. The voices weren't scattered randomly. They were sorted by frequency, intensity, origin. The deeper he moved through the vault, the more refined the voices became. Less chaotic, more personal. These weren't battle cries or mass trauma echoes. They were individual, like a library of forgotten thoughts, all bound together not by event but by suffering. And he became their caretaker. He started marking the walls, not with symbols, but with presence, a kind of imprint made only by aligning his breath with the vibration of a memory, embedding his own awareness into its rhythm. He never changed the voices, never tried to stop them. He only listened and catalogued. The archive began to shift, not physically, perceptually. The deeper he aligned with the memories, the more the layout of the ship changed for him. Corridors bent differently. Walls unfolded to reveal side chambers he hadn't seen before. The Force began showing him paths through the ship that others would miss entirely. Because he wasn't trespassing, he was tending. The Sith who had built the vault had done so in fear, afraid of losing their legacy, terrified that pain without record would vanish into the void. But Insanius had no fear of loss. He had no need to preserve. He was simply learning, one scream at a time, one voice at a time. There was one hallway he never entered. It sang with a hum too deep to be sound. Every time he passed it, the voices around him dimmed. Even the strongest echoes faded near it. The walls thickened, the air turned cold. That hall was reserved for a memory not yet made. His own. He would reach it in time. For now, he had work to do. He did not decide to create again. Creation decided for him. It began in the fourth cycle of the vault's shattered rotation, a span of time that meant nothing to stars, but everything to memories carved into steel. Insanius had been walking through a chamber where the walls whispered in broken harmony. The voices there were softer than most. Not screams, not terror. Regret. A whole room filled with the last breaths of Sith who had lived long enough to doubt themselves. He stood there, listening, until one voice caught on the edge of another, a resonance mismatch, a vibration that should not have existed, a pain not belonging to the one who had left it behind. It was borrowed. Something inside that echo was misplaced. He followed the distortion through the walls until he reached a small chamber made from collapsed support beams and torn wiring. In the center lay a cluster of nerve fibers, dried, brittle, dead. Yet they pulsed. Not biologically, rhythmically, like they were trying to remember a heartbeat they had never owned. Insanius crouched beside them. He didn't touch them. He didn't move them. He breathed. The pulse steadied. He traced the air, mapping the broken frequencies, aligning them with the memory echoes drifting through the ship. He matched regret with fear, fear with anger, anger with longing, not blending them, connecting them, like threads woven into fabric. The fibers reacted. They twisted toward him. Other remnants stirred from the edges of the room, flakes of muscle, broken cartilage, shredded tendons. Nothing alive, nothing preserved. He didn't gather them. They gathered themselves. Piece by piece, the residue of forgotten experiments began sliding across the metal floor, moving with intention they had never possessed. They were not following a command. They were following a pattern Insanius had aligned in the Force. A pattern shaped by pain. He said nothing. He only hummed. That low, steady hum he had used as a child. The one that synchronized breath with memory, thought with vibration. The chamber answered. Light bent around the forming mass. Echoes merged into shape. But this time, there was no body, no bone, no lungs, no flesh to bind. What he made was impression, a distortion given form. It rose from the floor slowly, not standing, but assembling itself into a silhouette, a figure shaped by absence, defined by agony that had nowhere to go. Its outline flickered, shifting between states, like it was being remembered rather than created. It had no face, but it had eyes. Two hollow impressions glowing faintly with trapped emotion, recognizing him not as creator or master, but as witness. The monster took its first breath. Except it wasn't breath. It was memory exhaling, compressed into motion. Not alive, but aware. It watched him with a silence that carried centuries of suffering, not its own, but collected. The vault responded violently. Chambers shook, walls warped, echoes screamed in overlapping tones, as if forced to relive themselves. The ship did not reject the creation. It acknowledged it. Insanius raised a hand, not to command, not to soothe, to understand. The monster leaned forward, not in obedience, but in recognition of the pattern that had shaped it. It did not hunger. It did not fear. It simply waited, a being built from memory, a creature woven from thousands of unfinished stories, something that should not exist, but now remembered enough to stand. Insanius lowered his hand. The monster stepped back, and the vault grew quiet, as if finally relieved that one of its countless screams had found a body of its own. No one came looking for him, not Sith, Not Jedi. Not scavengers, pirates, or salvagers. The deep core devoured signals. It bent light around collapsed stars and scattered hyperspace trails into madness. The vault ship was forgotten before it was even abandoned, a whisper beneath a scream, drifting in a region where maps had no meaning. And he preferred it that way. The creature he had formed, the one built not from flesh but from grief, now lingered in silence at the edge of the chamber. It did not speak. It did not move unless he did. It only breathed, as if the archive itself needed something alive to keep it turning. Insanius became the master of a place that had no rules. There were no apprentices, no oaths, no empires to serve. He did not crave order. He did not miss chaos. He simply watched. Every day he returned to the rooms of suffering, not to control them, but to tend them, like a keeper of a garden made of memory, pruning what had begun to decay, protecting what had not yet finished screaming. The echoes grew stronger, not louder, stronger. They responded to his presence like instruments, slowly tuning themselves to a forgotten song. When he walked into a chamber, the voices aligned. Their cadence shifted, their rhythm adjusted. They began forming patterns even he had not designed. He became part of the ship, or maybe the ship became part of him. He didn't need to eat. The force sustained him, or perhaps the memories did. It no longer mattered. He didn't measure time by rotations or cycles, but by patterns of echo. Which scream rose next? Which regret faded? Which hallucinated breath fell still? He remembered everyone. He gave them no names, but he knew them. The apprentice who'd broken under the pressure of expectation. The warlord who confessed too late. The Sith who carved her name into her own spine and forgot how to read it. He learned them like verses, recited them in silence, and built more. Not of flesh, not of crystal, of pain, suspended between truth and memory. He didn't speak to them. He was them. The archive did not reward him. There were no rituals, no visions, no power gained. But the force within him deepened, not like a flame growing brighter, but like a well sinking further into the rock. He saw nothing outside the ship. He didn't want to. Outside was the noise of civilizations, killing each other for reasons they didn't understand. Outside were Sith trying to rule things they hadn't even finished reading. Outside were Jedi still clinging to light while they drowned in shadow. He stayed inside. And in time, even the Force stopped asking questions. It stopped testing him, because it understood. This boy, this being, had never wanted to change the galaxy. He wanted to remember it, exactly as it was. In pain, in fragments, in silence. And so the vault became an extension of his will. Not a throne, not a prison. An archive. A place where the galaxy's most unwanted truths were allowed to breathe, alone, with him, and in that stillness, in that cold, suspended gravity where time had stopped caring, Insanius found something no Sith had ever held for long. Not peace, but quiet. The first sign was not a scream, it was silence. A research station orbiting the black dwarf of Rhinal stopped transmitting. Not with static, not with malfunction, just nothing. A perfect absence. One technician walked into a private chamber during a shift cycle and never came out. The others searched the module, but found only a handprint pressed into the inner hull. No blood, no residue, just pressure. He hadn't disappeared. He'd simply ended. Then a relay node on the edge of the core worlds failed. No damage, no evidence of breach. Every data packet was intact, except one, a time-stamped ping from a dead sector in the deep core. The file was empty, but heavy. Technicians said it felt wrong to touch. A week later, the Republic lost contact with an entire moon. There were no signs of battle, no signs of disease, no weather anomaly, no pirate activity, no planetary trauma, just a mass silence. Every voice gone, ships grounded, cities asleep with their lights still on. It wasn't war, it was withdrawal, as if the world itself had chosen to forget how to speak. And then, the stars dimmed. It started in the systems closest to the deep core, places no one visited, places that had been left behind by hyperspace lanes and galactic interest. Their suns grew quieter, not colder, quieter. Astronomers couldn't explain it. The stars didn't flicker, they muffled, like sound through cloth, like music behind closed doors. The Jedi noticed next, but not through alerts, not through alarms, through meditation. Master Sail Nivar, stationed on Denon, rose from a 2-day trance with tears in her eyes. She said she had felt a presence not approaching, listening, not near her but beneath her, beneath the galaxy itself. I felt the floor of the Force shift, she said, like something had moved its weight. Other Jedi began reporting disturbances, but they weren't disruptions in the usual sense. No rage, no screams of pain or fear, no tremors, just absence. They would reach out into the Force and find pockets of cold, emptiness without echo, places where the current didn't flow. When asked what it felt like, one Jedi described it in the simplest words. It felt like forgetting something I had just remembered. They tried to trace the feeling, chart its edge. But it was already moving. The silence was spreading, not like invasion, not like influence, like presence. A presence not claiming space, but making space around it fold in. And then came the whisper. One by one, the Force sensitives who had seen beyond the veil, the ex-Jedi, the Night Sisters, the broken students of dead temples began to speak it. Insanius walks again. Not aloud, not publicly. They said it in dreams. Some carved it into durasteel walls while half asleep. Some wrote it backwards on their windows in condensation. One man, an old Sith loyalist exiled on Athis, whispered the phrase before ending his own life with a calm smile. No one had seen him in over 20 years. No one had spoken the name of Insanius since before the Rusan Reformation. But now, without warning, without ships, without blood, the galaxy knew. The silence wasn't natural. It had a shape, and it was walking. Hyperspace did not scream. It stuttered. Pilots began reporting navigation anomalies near deep core thresholds. Not full malfunctions, not disruptions, just hesitation, momentary silences in the guidance systems. Ships would pause mid-jump for less than a second, then resume course. At first, it was dismissed. But then the jumps began to miss their targets. Cargo vessels emerged from hyperspace several sectors off course. Republic scouts dropped into systems they had no intention of visiting. Automated starcruisers drifted silently past uninhabited worlds, not broken, just confused. They hadn't been pulled off path. They had forgotten where they were going. Flight logs became corrupted not with static, but with blanks. Destination fields overwritten with null strings. Coordinates erased mid-jump. One ship transmitted a final message before vanishing. We are seeing stars that shouldn't exist. It was traced to a system that hadn't appeared on any map in 5,000 years. And then, without warning, dozens of ships began refusing to jump at all. Their engines engaged, their systems aligned. But the navicomputers locked up, not from damage, not from sabotage. They froze, as if the concept of location had become too heavy to compute. Sith acolytes aboard an unregistered frigate near the core reported a sensation they couldn't explain. The feeling that the stars were watching them. The apprentice collapsed in the middle of a corridor, eyes wide, mouth trembling. "She's not breathing," one of the crew said. But she was. Just not here. The Sith recovered after 2 days, but she never spoke again. Instead, she began drawing circles. Hundreds of them. Layered, overlapping, whisper thin. No two were the same. One Jedi Seeker recovered the files and brought them to Ossus. A historian of Force cartography recognized the patterns not as symbols but as routes, not through hyperspace, through feeling. They matched the pulse patterns of Force disturbances dating back centuries. Dozens of planets where silence had lingered just long enough to be noticed, then forgotten. Insanius, the Jedi whispered. But that name wasn't supposed to exist. Meanwhile, the drift continued. Unmanned vessels sent into the deep core returned altered. Hull panels bent inward at microscopic levels. Power cores that had never been activated hummed with static memory. Black box recordings played conversations that had never occurred. "Where are we? You were already here. I didn't come alone." No one ever does. But no one aboard had spoken those words. And then, one ship reappeared with no crew at all. The life support system was untouched. Supplies still sealed, engines intact. But the logs showed 32 jump cycles completed in less than a day. 32 different systems visited. None of them verifiable. None of them real. And etched across the inner bulkhead in carbon scoring was a phrase. He remembered where we were going. Not written by a hand. Burned by plasma in a curve too perfect to be human. Republic analysts sent droids. The droids returned functional. But each one brought back more mass than it left with. Not new material. Not upgrades. Just weight. As if memory itself had substance now. As if the ship had given them something to carry back. A feeling. A presence. A voice that didn't speak but sat in the corner of every thought. Gently reminding you, you were never supposed to leave. The Jedi did not sense danger. They sensed nothing. And that terrified them more. For thousands of years, the Order had known how the dark side behaved. It screamed, it burned, it reached, it bent minds and twisted futures until even the most disciplined master felt its weight in the Force. But what they felt now was not darkness. It was a void, a hollow absence spreading through the Force like frost across glass, thin at first, then widening, deepening, swallowing everything beneath it. Master Jorah Talvin was the first to speak of it openly. A calm, patient Jedi stationed on a long-range listening post above Aldreg V. She entered meditation expecting the usual flow of currents, the quiet river of presence that had guided the Order since its beginning. Instead, she found blankness. Not a disturbance. A gap. A space where the Force did not move. She tried again. Still nothing. A third time. Nothing. Not resistance. Not shadow. Just silence, as though something had cut a hole into the very fabric of the Force. When she opened her eyes, she was trembling. The Council dismissed it as exhaustion. But Talvin was not alone. Across the galaxy, seasoned masters began reporting the same sensation. Deep quiet. Chilled insight. The feeling that something enormous had stepped into the room behind them, without leaving a sound. Meditation chambers once warm with the hum of life now felt colder than tombs. The Force was retreating, or being pushed back. One night described it perfectly. It felt like the Force blinked. Another said, I reached inward and found no one looking back. But the most alarming report came from a lineage trained specifically to sense echoes, the Miraluka seers of Alpharides. Their sight depended on the Force. It was their world, their breath, their vision. And one morning, every seer in the primary enclave went blind. Not physically, spiritually. The Force around them vanished for 3 full minutes. When it returned, it did so violently, flooding their senses and leaving half the enclave unconscious. The survivors said they had seen a shape during the blackout. Not a person, not a creature, a silhouette, a presence standing at the center of the void. They could not describe it. Its outline shifted like a reflection on broken water. But they all agreed on one detail. It had no breath, no living presence, as if the Force itself could not decide whether it existed. The council convened instantly. Ancient archives were opened. Records from the Old Republic, the Great Hyperspace War, the Mandalorian Crusades, anything that referenced mass silencing of the Force. Nothing matched. Nothing except a single sealed note in an obscure codex written by Master Odin Rel nearly 4 millennia earlier. A warning rarely quoted, barely remembered. Beware the ones who are not wounds in the Force, but places where the Force refuses to be. The phrase unsettled the council so deeply that they ordered it removed from public archives. Meanwhile, the void grew. Temple gardens wilted without reason. Kyber crystals hummed off-key during attunement. Younglings cried at night, claiming their dreams made no sound. One Padawan claimed she saw her future not in visions, but in silence so total it felt like drowning. Masters trained in detect essence reached out, only to feel their own presence fade. Whatever was moving through the galaxy was not hiding from them. It simply didn't acknowledge them at all. And then, during a meditation on Yavin the Four, one master finally heard a whisper inside the void. A name, spoken without voice, carried without force. A name that should not have survived history. Insanius. The master collapsed, his heart still beating, his mind emptied. He did not arrive. He was already there. Witnesses would later swear they'd seen him, but no two could agree on what they'd seen. Some described a cloaked figure with no face. Others said they saw a blur, like heat on metal, just standing still. One said she saw a child not young, but unfinished, humming softly with his eyes closed. None could remember how he left. All they remembered was how it felt to be near him. Not fear, not awe, absence. Like their thoughts couldn't hold shape in his presence. Like their memory flickered just enough to forget how to think. No one spoke to him, because the moment they tried, they realized they didn't know what they were going to say. He didn't kill anyone. But a senator from the core worlds fainted at the exact moment he passed through a mining ring outside Orinda, a place he was never seen, but later confirmed by telemetry that stopped for exactly 8 seconds. She woke up gasping, whispering the same phrase over and over. He isn't here, but he's real. Ships caught glimpses of him walking through empty docking bays that had been sealed for years. Surveillance footage showed no trace, but magnetic locks rebooted after his passage, lights dimmed without electrical cause, and the Force-sensitive crew members wept for reasons they couldn't explain. One apprentice on Lothal described it best. I didn't see him, I felt him, like I was being looked at by something that no longer needed to breathe. The phrase spread quietly, among Sith remnants, among archivists, among those who had always suspected the galaxy had forgotten something important. He was no longer living in the way others understood life. He didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't leave behind heat signatures or biosigns. He didn't leave behind anything. He walked through space the way a thought moves through the mind, passing through without leaving prints, but never truly gone. Insanius had crossed a threshold the Sith had only theorized, a state where the Force no longer required a vessel to carry will. A form of being shaped by memory alone, built from echoes, sustained by pain, and animated not by desire but by awareness. The Jedi called it impossible. The Sith called it unnatural. But neither could deny it was happening. The archives that still remembered his name, the ones not yet buried, not yet purged, began to shut down when accessed. Holocrons containing his sigils refused to open. One shattered itself when a researcher merely touched it with a question in mind. No words had been spoken aloud, only intention. The Force was defending itself from him, or from what he had become. And still, he walked, through derelict stations, through uncharted moons, through the minds of Force sensitives who felt him brush past them without sound. No message, no prophecy, no agenda, just a presence that no longer needed life to exist. He wasn't ghost, he wasn't shadow, he wasn't Sith, he wasn't Jedi, he was remnant. A leftover thought the galaxy had failed to discard. A presence that hadn't been destroyed, only allowed to continue. And so he did, quietly, eternally. A myth without breath, a shape the Force could not describe, and a name no one could say without hearing silence in return. They said Master Kaluan should not have survived. Not the first time. He was there when the Order lost contact with the first outpost. Not as a warrior, as a watcher. A quiet, aging Jedi with eyes too tired for conflict and a voice that no longer raised above a whisper. He was one of the last to hear the original silence before it became myth, before the others started calling it Insanius again. He never forgot. Even after he was pulled from the field. Even after his name was quietly removed from active duty. Even after his students were given to other masters, Kaluan remembered. Not the way most Jedi remembered, with discipline, with detachment. He remembered with weight. And that weight never left him. In his dreams, he still saw the moment the silence arrived, not with dread, but with stillness, a presence entering a room with no sound. A breath held too long, a feeling too cold for space and too real to be imagined. And a shape, a figure who had no presence in the Force, but whose gaze bent everything around it like gravity. Kaluan never spoke of what he saw. He didn't need to. The Council assumed the silence had fractured his mind, that the incident had hollowed his connection to the Force, that the brokenness they sensed in him was injury, not awareness. They were wrong. He had not lost his connection to the Force. He had seen something the Force could not explain, and it looked back. Years passed. He was moved from outpost to archive. From archive to meditation hall. From meditation hall to retirement sanctuary. A quiet descent into irrelevance. But the memory remained. Not just of Insanius. Of what Insanius had become. Then, the galaxy changed again. One by one, systems fell silent. Jedi began to feel absence where presence once bloomed. Holocrons refused to open. Kyber crystals dimmed, and the Force grew heavier in rooms once filled with light. And Kaluan knew. He didn't need a vision. He didn't need proof. He felt it the moment it started. Because he had never stopped listening. The others noticed his shift. He began walking more, sleeping less, pacing between stone corridors and unlit meditation rooms. Not in fear. In preparation. For what? They couldn't understand. One night asked him gently if he was unwell. Kaluan smiled. Not unwell, he said. just remembering in both directions. When the whispers started, when the name resurfaced, when the silence began touching worlds the council could no longer ignore, Caliwan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand. He offered. "I will go," he said. The room was still. The council hesitated, because deep down, they knew what he meant. He would go alone, not to fight, not to kill, not even to stop what had started. He would go because he had already seen what no one else had survived. Because Insanius knew him. And he, somehow, still knew Insanius. Not as the Force's enemy, as its question. Caliwan stood at the edge of the council chamber. Eyes calm, spine bowed with time, breath steady. "I don't believe he means to destroy us," he said. "I believe he's asking if we still remember why we were worth saving." No one answered. So he left. Not escorted, not recorded, just an old Jedi walking into the galaxy's deepest silence, to speak with something the Force could no longer define. The council chambers had not changed in centuries. The same high ceilings, the same light filtered through crystalline panels, the same chairs curved in quiet judgment, the same stillness mistaken for peace. But now, the stillness was real, not serene, not reflective, just empty, because silence had reached the Jedi Order, and they had no words to meet it. Master Caliwan's report had been archived but never read aloud. His memories recorded but never reviewed. His injuries studied but not his insight. Because the truth made them uneasy. That the Force, their greatest ally, their sacred teacher, was not warning them. It was withdrawing, and something else had taken its place. When Caliwan stood before them once more, there were no accusations, no anger, no demands. Only a request. "Let me go. Let me try. Let me speak to him." But the council, bound by generations of caution, responded with the only thing they had left: procedure. No single master may act on behalf of the Order without consensus. Direct engagement with a non-communicative anomaly is inadvisable. We must first consult the archives. The archives had no answers, only fear, because buried in restricted volumes, far beneath the official records, there were phrases not meant to survive. Lines written in haste during past crises. Annotations from Jedi who had once tried to describe what Caliwan now faced. One said, "There are things the Force will not warn us about, because it does not know how." Another, "Beware the presence that does not arrive, only reveals that it never left." They never said Insanius by name, but the shape was there. The void, the silence, the presence, and the council, though they would never admit it, recognized it. But action would mean admission. Admission would mean fear. And fear would mean the code had failed them. So they spoke in circles. "We cannot trust the testimony of one who has already been touched. If this being is a wound in the Force, any approach could spread the fracture. If we wait, more clarity may come." But clarity never came. Just more silence. Just more ships gone dark. More younglings who couldn't hear the Force. More masters waking from dreams with no memory of sleep. And still, they sat. Because the Jedi feared something greater than death. Power they could not name. Even the Sith had names. Forms, patterns of behavior, methods of corruption. Strategies that could be anticipated, resisted, countered. But Insanius was not strategy. He was absence. He could not be debated, or baited, or reasoned into darkness. Because he was not trying to win. He was simply being. A fact the council could not absorb. So when Caliwan left without approval, without escort, without anger. No one stopped him. Not out of respect, out of relief, because his departure spared them the burden of decision. In their hearts, they hoped he would fail quietly, that Insanius would disappear again, that the memory would fade once more into apocrypha. They didn't realize what they had done. They had passed the burden to one man, not a warrior, not a savior, just a Jedi who refused to forget what silence felt like. And as Calawan's ship vanished into the rift, a final thought stirred in the mind of the youngest council member. If he does not return, we will not know he is gone, because the silence would not tell them, and the Force would no longer speak. The rift had no name, not officially. It appeared on star charts only as a navigational void, a misaligned wedge of hyperspace corridors in the deep core where ancient gravitational scars twisted transit routes into nonsense. To Calawan, it was a graveyard, not of ships, but of meaning. Because words could not hold there, memory became slippery, and the Force bent in strange ways. He had been there before, not physically, not even in meditation, but in the echo of his first encounter with Insanius, when his thoughts had stopped forming into language, when fear had not struck him but unraveled him. And now he returned willingly. The journey was not marked by light years, but by the loss of reference. In the first system, he could still hear the Force faint, like a breath on glass. By the third, it whispered nonsense, too soft to follow, too wrong to dismiss. By the time he crossed the final vector into the rift, there was nothing left but him. His ship, an old Delta class, moved slower than protocol required. Calawan disengaged its autopilot, not to control the journey, but to feel it. Every hum in the hull, every hesitation in the navicomp, every flicker in his mind. He stopped trusting instruments by the second day. They showed destinations he hadn't selected. One route bent back on itself, twice, once physically, once mentally. He remembered taking it before he actually had. And his sleep stopped happening, not by choice, not by insomnia, because the rift did not allow forgetting. The rift kept him awake, not in alertness, in unraveling. There were voices in the hull, not external, not ghosts, just memory. A Padawan who once asked him why silence mattered. A friend who never returned from the outer rim. A whisper soft, almost kind, that simply asked, "Why are you still afraid of me?" He knew the voice, and he answered it. "I'm not afraid of you." And for a moment, he wasn't. The rift thickened. Time stretched, then curled. He stopped tracking days, or moments, or systems. Eventually, even the stars thinned. Not from distance, but from irrelevance. Because in this place, light did not mean presence, sound did not mean life, and the Force simply watched. He found a moon that wasn't there before. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting to be remembered. It had no orbit, no mass signature, but it pulled him closer without propulsion. He landed. Or something in him did. The surface was black stone, smooth and rippling with echoes. Not sound, memory. He stepped out. No air, but he breathed. No wind, but something moved past him. No life, but the ground remembered pain. Every step he took triggered a moment not his own, but someone's. A scream, a farewell, a betrayal. The rift did not hold death. It held imprints, and Calawan walked through them like pages in a book written in loss. He did not call out. He knew Insanius was near, not because of danger, because he felt clarity. No more voices, No more gravity, just stillness. And then, at the edge of a fault in the stone, he saw it. A figure, not moving, not watching, just present, like a thought that had been waiting to be remembered. Not a Sith, not a wound, not a monster, just Insanius. And for the first time, Kaluan understood. He had not come to confront darkness. He had come to sit beside it. Kaluan approached slowly, not out of fear, out of respect. There was no wind on this fractured moon, yet the air trembled around Insanius like sound trapped inside stone. The figure did not turn, did not shift, did not breathe, but Kaluan knew he was aware. Awareness was the only thing about him that still resembled life. He stopped a few steps behind the being who had once been a child, once been an apprentice, once been a memory forged in suffering. Insanius, Kaluan said softly. His voice vanished before it reached the air. Not swallowed, unmade, like the rift refused to carry his words. Still, Insanius reacted. A tilt of the head, barely perceptible, like someone recalling a sound they had heard long ago. Kaluan felt the force thin around him, not in rejection, in hesitation, as if deciding whether to remain present for whatever came next. He tried again. You know why I'm here. Silence. But Kaluan sensed something underneath it, not emotion, but shape. Silence could have form, if one listened long enough. And this silence felt circular, like a loop, like remembering and forgetting at the same time. He stepped closer. I didn't come to stop you. More silence. I came because I'm the only one who remembers what you were. A flicker. Insanius's outline blurred, just for a moment, like a reflection on disturbed water. Kaluan took a careful breath. I saw you before the others tried to give you a name, before the rituals, before the pain became your language. I saw the boy who didn't speak because he was listening to everything. The silence shifted, not broken, tilted, as if the rift itself had leaned in. He continued, You're not here to destroy the galaxy. If you wanted that, nothing could stop you. You're here because the galaxy forgot something. Something you never stopped carrying. Insanius's shape sharpened again. Not threatening, present. Kaluan lowered himself to the stone and sat. His old bones protested, but he welcomed the ache. Pain made life clearer. He looked up at the being before him. You're waiting, he whispered. Not a question, a truth. The air around Insanius thickened. The silence became heavier. Kaluan felt pressure behind his eyes, like memories not his own trying to push through. He closed them gently. Show me, he said. For a moment, just one Kaluan felt what Insanius felt. Not visions, not voices, not prophecy. Memory, memory without order, without time, without beginning. A galaxy screaming through centuries of conflict, betrayal, slaughter, and fear. The echo of pain etched into every star. The ache of lives forgotten. The weight of truths buried because no one wanted to remember them. Insanius had not become void. He had become archive. A living library of everything the Force wished it could forget. Kaluan gasped, not from suffering, from understanding. You carry what we want. Insanius moved for the first time. A single step, no sound, no impact, just presence. He stood before Kaluan, now taller, heavier, dimmer, like gravity wrapped around a shadow. Kaluan did not rise. He looked up into the faceless outline and spoke the last words he would ever say to anyone. You don't need to be alone with it. The silence answered, not with voice, with stillness, deep, unbroken, final. Insanius reached out a hand, not touching, not taking, just offering the shape of acknowledgement. And Calawan understood. Some conversations were not meant to be spoken. Some truths survived only in silence. And some beings were not meant to be saved or destroyed, only witnessed. The rift folded around them. Two figures, one alive, one remembering, both sitting inside a silence older than the Force itself. Calawan closed his eyes. Insanius did not need to. They had only one weapon left. Not the Force, not wisdom, not courage, forgetfulness. Because after Calawan vanished into the rift, after reports of Insanius spread across systems like quiet storms, after silence became its own language, the Jedi Council understood a truth they could not speak aloud. They could not defeat him. They could not contain him. They could not even name what he had become. And so, they chose the oldest form of cowardice the Order had ever practiced. They decided to erase him, not kill, not imprison, erase. The idea did not come from a living master. It came from the archives, from a sealed vault beneath the oldest wing of the temple on Ossus, back when the Jedi were not yet guardians, but wanderers frightened of their own visions. The ritual of unnaming. It had no author, no recorded creator, just a warning carved into its container. This will protect us only from what we fear to remember. The council gathered in secret. Not all of them. Only the ones too afraid to risk the truth, too fragile to face the silence that had already reached their dreams. They spoke in whispers, as if saying Insanius's name aloud would summon him into the chamber. One master argued, "He is not a being anymore. He is an echo shaping itself into presence." Another said, "Then we must unshape him." But the oldest among them said nothing, because she remembered seeing the ritual once before, used not on an enemy, but on a Jedi whose vision of the future nearly tore the Order apart. They erased his name, sealed his memories, and told history he had never existed. And yet, the wound of that lie still ached. Now, they sought to repeat it, to hide Insanius not from the galaxy, but from themselves. The ritual began at dusk, under a sky where the stars seemed dimmer than they had the night before. Not because of pollution, because the Force itself felt thinner, as if holding its breath. They lit no candles. They drew no sigils. The ritual of unnaming was not performed with tools. It required only three things: memory, fear, and intention. The masters stood in a circle, closed their eyes, spoke his name once, only once, because the ritual demanded that the final time a name was spoken, it became its own undoing. Insanius. The sound lingered for a heartbeat too long, like the air was reluctant to let it go. Then came the cold, not wind, not temperature, a cold that wrapped around thought, pulling at the edges of memory like fingers scraping ice. One master gasped as the image of a boy standing in a burning lab flickered, then vanished from his mind. Another felt the memory of Calawan blur, dissolve, fragment. They continued anyway, because they believed the galaxy would be safer if his name was gone. The ritual pulled harder. Holocrons in nearby chambers dimmed, their indexing sigils stuttering as entries shifted on their own. Records of deep core disturbances were scrambled. Meditation journals reworded themselves. Even the stone beneath the council's feet groaned, as if something inside it were being scraped out. Then the final phase came, the moment the ritual reached the Force itself. A tremor rippled through the temple, not physical, not seismic, conceptual. Like an idea dying, the masters exhaled together, His name was gone, forgotten by the Order, erased from the archives, scrubbed from every corner of their collective memory. But as the silence settled, a young knight outside collapsed. Not in pain, in grief. She didn't know why she was crying. She didn't know what she'd lost. All she could say, through shaking breath, was, "Something that mattered isn't here anymore." Inside the chamber, the oldest master heard this and bowed her head, because she understood what the others did not. You can erase a name, but you cannot erase the place where that name once lived. And the Force never forgets a wound. It had no author, no origin, no teachings attached to it. The Jedi called it the ritual of unnaming. But even that was a placeholder, a title wrapped around a void. It predated the Sith, predated the Jedi, predated the Force being called the Force. And it had only ever been used 4 times in recorded history. Each time, something ancient disappeared. Each time, the galaxy grew quieter. It was not a weapon. It was not a lesson. It was an act of removal. A wound dressed up as protection. And now they had used it again. But not all Jedi had agreed. One archivist, a former seeker of forgotten lore, tried to halt the ritual. He argued that memory, even dark memory, was part of the Force's flow. That unweaving a presence from history would unweave the balance itself. He was ignored. Another master asked quietly, "If we do this, and he returns, how will we know it's him?" No one answered. Because the ritual didn't just erase the name, it erased the threads. Threads of connection, threads of lineage, of origin, of prophecy, of consequence. Once completed, even Force sensitives could no longer trace the ripples back to a source. The person became a silence, a hole in history that others instinctively avoided. The texts that described the ritual were not books. They were carvings, shallow, desperate things found on the underside of a collapsed temple near Korriban, buried under rock that had never seen light. The carvings were etched backwards, not in code, in rejection, as if the writer didn't want them to be read, only left behind. The language was neither Sith nor Jedi. It was older. It spoke in negation. Not what is, but what must no longer be. One phrase translated, roughly, to, "You must empty the echo until even silence forgets it was ever a sound." The council used that line during the ritual, not as a chant, but as a surrender. Because deep down, they knew this wasn't justice. It was retreat. They had no answer to Insanius, no counter to what he had become. So they made themselves blind and called it mercy. But the Force shifted. It did not cry out. It did not resist. It just changed, subtly, as if a nerve had been severed somewhere deep inside its body. Some Jedi stopped dreaming. Others stopped meditating altogether, not by discipline, but because the visions no longer came. And a few began hearing things they could not describe. Not voices, not words, impressions, like standing in a room where someone once screamed so loudly that the walls remembered it. The ritual of unnaming had been completed. Insanius was gone from the records, gone from the minds of those who once feared him, gone from every known holocron and temple and tongue. But the cost was beginning to surface. Not through war, through detachment. The Jedi grew colder, less trusting, more divided, as if they had buried something so deep they could no longer feel the ground beneath their own thoughts. And the galaxy noticed. Out on the rim, smugglers began reporting Force anomalies, whole sectors where hyperspace refused to function properly. strange gravitational pockets that pulled ships sideways not physically but emotionally, as if the galaxy itself had moods it could no longer regulate. The ritual had worked, but it hadn't healed anything. It had only pushed the wound beneath the skin. And one night, far from the Jedi Temple, on a forgotten moon used for Sith artifact storage, a lone Padawan, meditating in secret, had a vision. She didn't see a figure. She didn't hear a name. She just whispered, trembling. Something's still listening. And the air around her turned cold. It started with a feeling, a sense that something was missing, but not in the ordinary way. Not like forgetting where a lightsaber was placed or losing the name of a planet from a childhood chart. This was deeper, older, as if the Force itself was blinking too often, trying to remember what had once filled the space behind its own eyes. Jedi across the galaxy began meditating less. Not because they chose to, because when they reached into the Force, they felt nothing reaching back. At first, they thought it was grief, then imbalance, then some hidden war in the outer rim they hadn't yet detected. But the healers knew better. In dream clinics across Ossus and Coruscant, younglings began painting strange shapes. Eyes with no pupils, mouths without faces, a man with no name. Some whispered in their sleep. One Padawan from Corellia drew the same symbol every night for a month, a black spiral wrapped in jagged red lines, identical to a forgotten sigil from the vaults of Arcania. No one taught it to her. She didn't know what it meant. But when asked why she drew it, she only said, "Because he's trying to get back in." The Jedi refused to investigate. Officially, the event was labeled psychic residue, leftover trauma from the Clone Wars, from ancient Sith echoes, from Malakor's wounds, from Exar Kun's collapse. But a small few kept digging. One of them was a Mirialan master who specialized in restoring damaged holocrons. She found an archive that had been partially affected by the ritual of unnaming. A small data fracture that hadn't fully dissolved. Inside it, a single line of corrupted script. Not a name, not a date, just a warning. He made himself forgettable, so he could be remembered without resistance. It chilled her, because it meant something worse than survival. It meant design. Insanius hadn't simply returned. He had planned to. By becoming the absence in the minds of those sworn to remember. And across the galaxy, small symptoms began to bloom. A smuggler in the mid-rim went blind mid-jump, not from injury, but from a vision so overwhelming his body shut down. A Gungan outpost experienced collective silence for 48 hours, no speech, no thought, no Force activity. A senator collapsed in the middle of a peace negotiation with no physical trauma. Only the phrase, "I remember." What? Even droids malfunctioned. Not from hardware failure, from directionlessness. Their navigation logs erased, their core priorities scrambled, as if they had been told a purpose once, and now couldn't bear the silence of its removal. Every sign pointed back to something or someone who had been erased so thoroughly. Only grief remained behind. But grief, unlike memory, cannot be deleted. It anchors, it stains, it returns. The Force is memory, living, breathing, unspoken. And now, it began remembering on its own, without permission, without containment, without names. Some Jedi began waking from meditation with tears on their faces. Not from fear, from recognition. They didn't know why. They just whispered the same thing. He didn't die. He became absence itself. And absence is not peace. It is pressure. It is a vacuum that pulls thought into shapes it never should have formed. Insanius had not been destroyed. He had become the shape of forgetting, a shadow sculpted out of deliberate silence. And now, the galaxy remembered him, not through records, through pain, through dreams, through everything the Jedi refused to face. Because memory is not data, it is sensation. And somewhere, deep within the Force, he had never truly been forgotten. The ritual ended, the name vanished. The Jedi exhaled as if a burden had been lifted. But the Force did not relax. Something subtle shifted. Not a cry, not a disturbance, a recoil, like touching scarred tissue that never healed properly. Because erasing a name does not erase a life, and unmaking memory does not unmake impact. All it does, all it ever did, is push the wound where no one wants to look. The first echo appeared on Jeddah. A monk meditating before dawn felt a pressure behind his thoughts, like a hand gently covering his eyes. He sensed no malice, only weight, a heavy stillness that wanted to be noticed. When he opened his eyes, the sand around him had formed a perfect spiral, not carved, not blown by wind, shaped by presence. He had no idea what it meant, but he cried anyway, because something in him remembered losing something he had never been given. The second echo came from the Sith, a hidden cult on Dromund Kars, long forgotten and barely surviving in the jungles, discovered that one of their ancient tablets had cracked open on its own. Inside it, a blank slab, pure obsidian, untouched. But when light struck it, even faintly, a shadow appeared on its surface. Not a reflection, a silhouette, standing still, facing away, waiting. Their leader fainted at the sight, and did not wake for a full day. The third echo happened where no Jedi or Sith could reach. In the space between systems, a drifting probe, its mission, long abandoned, captured a single frame of visual data before its lens corroded into dust. A figure standing on nothing, feet planted on vacuum, cloak unmoving though there was no wind, and a long smear of distortion where the face should have been. The probe died before transmitting the full image, but the partial packet reached a Republic relay. 3 technicians quit the same night. The fourth began whispering a name he didn't remember learning. None of them had known Insanius. None had read his erased entries. None had heard the warning carved into a ruined archive. But wounds do not need names to hurt. And this wound, this deliberate tear in the tapestry of the Force, began to echo louder. Not as sound, as absence. The Force itself started forming blind spots, moments where masters felt themselves drifting, untethered, as though their senses stepped into a room with no walls. Even the Sith felt it. One acolyte in the unknown regions reported losing her own shadow for several minutes. When it returned, she claimed it felt slower, as if it had been somewhere she couldn't follow. But the clearest sign came from the holocrons. Those ancient vessels of knowledge, so stubborn, so rigid, so proud, began to flicker when approached. Some refused to open. Some opened to the wrong recordings. Some displayed fractured images of temples not yet built. One spoke a sentence the Jedi archivist swore she recognized, though she had never heard it recorded. A name erased is only a door left unlocked. And somewhere in the deep core, far beyond navigation, far beyond maps, far beyond the reach of fear or hope, Insanius stood again. Not alive, not dead, not present, not gone. Simply there. A shape the Force tried not to notice. A pressure forming in the blind spot of reality. The name had been erased, but the place where the name once lived, The hollow carved by fear, memory, and silence remained open, and in that hollow the Force trembled, because something was returning. Not a boy, not a Sith, not a monster, a memory that refused to die, an echo in a wound the galaxy tried to forget. It began in places no longer visited. Vaults buried beneath fortress ruins, cracked temples wrapped in vines older than maps, outposts erased from galactic registries, rooms that had been forgotten for good reason. On Korriban, in a sealed antechamber deep below the Valley of the Dark Lords, a Sith sigil, dormant for 1,000 years, ignited with no contact, no heat, no sound, just light, dull, red, then brighter. The guards outside never saw it, but one acolyte felt it. He collapsed mid-meditation, clutching his head. He said he could hear the stone thinking, and beneath the layers of echo and pain, it was whispering to be let out. On Thule, an ancient Sith monolith long believed inert cracked down its middle, not from stress, not from weather, but from heat pulsing inside it. A rhythm like breath, not air, memory. The Jedi who studied it vanished the same week. No sign of conflict, just an open notebook, the last page blank, but soaked in sweat. And on Arcania, a museum of war relics began reporting strange malfunctions. Holoprojectors stuttered, databanks reset, security droids powered down without reason. One curator tried to access a sealed file labeled Sith Ritual, D-null. The screen refused. It displayed only a spiral. He wasn't Force-sensitive, but he cried for 3 hours afterward. The galaxy didn't panic, not yet, because the symptoms were small, scattered, seemingly unrelated. But then came the pattern, the same symbol, the same shape, always reappearing, a curved spiral wrapped in an unfinished circle, sometimes scratched into walls, sometimes etched into stone, sometimes burned into the bark of trees that should not have survived fire. Those who studied it began hearing things, low hums, breathing without lungs, the sound of footsteps from behind mirrors. No message, no demand, just pressure, not an invasion, a return. The Order of the Sith, eternal, tried to ban the symbol, but the more they suppressed it, the more it showed up. In dreams, in echoes, in ritual sites that refused to die. Even on Wayland, where reality itself bent, the sigil appeared on a clone tank's surface, despite no one ever carving it. The Kaminoan scientists fled the lab within minutes. One of them never spoke again. He simply drew the symbol over and over, even after being sedated. The Jedi Council, much reduced by then, sent no delegation. They had seen it before. They just didn't remember where. Not consciously, but memory isn't always conscious. Sometimes the Force remembers for you. And now, the Force was remembering things it had been told to forget. The sigils did not spread with intent. They were not marks of conquest. They were echoes of a presence. Something sealed, not slain. Banished, not broken. Erased, not ended. A voice that once lived outside of time, now whispered through the fractures of history. Each sigil pulsed when touched, not with heat, with grief, and anyone who lingered long enough began to feel something strange. A loneliness older than the Jedi, a sorrow colder than the Sith, and a presence rising from underneath it all. Not with vengeance, not with fury, but with remembrance. Insanius had not died. He had become a return. And now, the symbols weren't calling him. They were welcoming him back. The first death went unnoticed. A Sith initiate in the Outer Rim, failed to wake from meditation. He hadn't been injured. His vitals were stable. His connection to the Force was strong. But his mind was missing. Not destroyed, not broken, just gone. His body remained seated, hands still in posture. But his eyes, though open, saw nothing. No fear, no peace, just silence. His blood had pooled in his robes without a wound. It had formed a spiral. He had bled in his sleep, and no one could explain how. They burned the body, but the stain reappeared the next night. Across the galaxy, the phenomenon spread slowly. A young Sith apprentice collapsed mid-sparring. Her limbs convulsed. She clawed at her own skin as if trying to tear something out. No one understood what she was saying, until they played the recording backwards. She was speaking, in perfect, calm tones. But the words were not hers, and the voice was not hers. It was male, older, detached, and it said only one thing. "You brought me back wrong." The instructor who reviewed the footage refused to speak again. Another apprentice, this one deep within the maw, woke screaming. Not from pain, from recognition. He said he had seen himself standing in the middle of a storm. Not outside it, made of it. He described hearing thousands of voices chanting in languages no one taught him. Voices that sounded like his own, over and over. And a figure, standing motionless, facing away. When he described the shape of the figure's robes, his hands started bleeding. Without touching anything, without any weapon, without realizing it, the medics treated him. He forgot the vision. But the spiral pattern burned itself into the temple walls that night. There was no sign of forced entry. The Sith began to suspect sabotage. They interrogated their own. They tortured suspected Jedi spies. None confessed. None knew anything. Because there was no infiltrator. There was only a presence. And it was already inside. Some started seeing things while awake. Acolytes claimed to see themselves walking by, but in reverse. Some found hair or skin samples in their beds that belonged to no one. A few said they heard their names being spoken behind them in voices identical to their own. One broke his own fingers to silence the sound. Still, the Sith did not stop training. They believed pain was proof of progress. Until one master cracked a mirror in the meditation halls of Moraband. Behind the glass, she found a spiral drawn not on the back, but inside the glass itself. The blood running down her nose traced the same pattern. She was never seen again, and her replacement lasted less than a week. The spiral began appearing inside the minds of Force sensitives who had never been trained. Outer Rim villagers, escaped slaves, orphaned children. Each of them reported the same dream. A man, not a man, standing in a cold room with no walls. No face. Just a feeling. One word, spoken without sound. Not in basic, not in high Sith. Just pressure behind the eyes. A pressure that said, "Return." No one knew the name. Not yet. But the Force did. Because blood remembers what minds forget. And somewhere between the waking and the dreaming, Insanius waited. Not as a ghost, not as a god, but as something worse. A presence returning without needing to move. A shadow that didn't chase you. It rose inside you. The first archivist vanished on Arsus. Not a Padawan. Not a field Jedi. An old scholar named Rin Talvi, a man who had spent his entire life cataloging forgotten scripts, cross-referencing Force languages, preserving what others ignored. He was last seen entering the deep archives restricted wing with a datapad under his arm. Security footage showed him pausing at the entrance, turning his head slightly, as if listening to someone whisper his name. Then he walked forward, not through the doorway, into the wall. He didn't collide, he didn't fall. He simply entered it, disappearing as cleanly as smoke drifting into stone. The footage ended there. When investigators arrived, the stone felt cold. Not physically, metaphysically. Cold in a way that pressed into the mind like a forgotten memory trying to climb back to the surface. They sealed the room for safety. The next archivist vanished 3 days later. A young Togruta scholar, brilliant, disciplined, cautious, vanished inside the codex vault. Her marker bead fell on the floor, still warm. But she was gone, no trace, no struggle, no warp signatures. The stone behind her desk carried a faint spiral. The third archivist didn't disappear. He came back wrong. Found wandering the halls of the Jedi Temple at dawn. Barefoot, pupils dilated, whispering a phrase he could not stop repeating. He's reading us back. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know what back meant. He only said the words until his throat bled. He died that night, peacefully, without fear, still whispering. The Jedi Council blamed stress, work fatigue, residual Sith corruption. But the archives had already begun to shift. Holocrons flickered when touched. Some refused to open, even for masters. Some played the wrong memories. Some displayed entries that had been sealed centuries ago, entries the Jedi themselves did not remember writing. One holocron whispered, "Why did you erase what you were afraid to see?" It wasn't a message. It wasn't a voice. It was memory trying to put itself back together. Archivists reported books closing on their own, scrolls rearranging their order, pages flipping faster than the wind could move them. A Quarren cataloger swore she saw her own handwriting appear in a codex she had never transcribed. The sentence was simple: he was never gone. She handed in her resignation and fled Ossus the same evening. Meanwhile, temples across the Mid-Rim reported similar disturbances. On Deveron, the ancient library doors unlocked themselves and resealed, trapping the keeper inside. When they finally broke the seal, she was standing in the center of the room, tracing spirals in the dust with a trembling finger. Her eyes were open. Her mind was not. She remembered nothing, except that something had been put back. The Sith, too, noticed. On Ziost, ancient data cores began expelling corrupted files, fragments of rituals that no longer made sense, glyphs half-translated into shapes no Sith scholar recognized. But one fragment appeared everywhere. A child's outline, head tilted, watching, the same figure that had stood in vaults, in ruins, in dreams. The figure no Sith could name anymore. Some tried to ban research into the phenomenon. Some tried to contain the spirals. Some tried to erase what had returned. But archivists understand something the galaxy always forgets. Knowledge never dies. It waits. And when it is forced into silence, it finds another way to speak. Now, the archives of both Jedi and Sith for the first time in history whispered in the same voice. Not words, not warnings, just a presence. A cold, quiet pressure behind the eyes. Insanius was not reappearing. He was recollecting himself. Across stone, across memory, across minds that no longer remembered they had once erased him. And the Force trembled, because even knowledge feared what came next.